Chapter 655. 3 days later the silver disappeared. It was all given out as compensation. The 5-star army had truly become a protective force that cared for the citizens of Narcissus Town. On the same morning, the final item of the joint trial, the sentencing, it officially began. Qin Bo was still the one presiding over the meeting. In his hand he held a statistical report of the 3 days since the public trial. Using the loudspeaker he read it out loud. Borte was indicted for 17,832 crimes. After verification he was found to have been an accomplice for 17,725 crimes. Due to his heinous crimes he was sentenced to the punishment of death by 1,000 cuts. Bagan was indicted for 15,347 crimes. After verification he was found to have been an accomplice for 14,628 crimes. Due to his heinous crimes he was sentenced to the punishment of death by 1,000 cuts. Centurion Zhang Maoshi was indicted for. The loud and clear voice kept ringing in the air above the square. The people whose names were called had a look of despair on their faces. At that moment, even death had become a kind of happiness because they still had to go through thousands of cuts before they could close their eyes and die. As the crimes were read out, the first cry was heard in the square. Then more and more cries were heard. These were the spontaneous cries of the people who had suffered and been wronged. Originally, they thought that they would never be able to get justice for the injustice that happened to them. However, the 5-star army came and helped them solve everything. At this moment, in their hearts, the 5-star army was like their parents who had given them a new lease of life. At this moment they were probably willing to do anything that was asked of them. Of course, not all generals were sentenced to death. For example, Hu Lu and Tai Muching were special cases. The only reason they were sentenced to death was because they had beaten and scolded the soldiers under them. It was also because they expected better from the soldiers, so it wasn't considered a crime at all. Even though Yang Qindong didn't advocate corporal punishment, there were still some recruits who liked it. It was useless to reason with such people. Sometimes the effect of a kick was better than 1,000 words of warning and education. Therefore, even in Xianxia's army, as long as it wasn't targeted and the veterans didn't make things difficult for the new recruits, the higher-ups would tacitly approve of some corporal punishment. Of course, the prerequisite was that the person couldn't be crippled. If that was the case, all the officers involved would be implicated. It was precisely because Hu Lu and Tai Mu'er didn't commit any serious mistakes that they, as defeated generals, were only given 3 lashes each. This was the same as overlooking the fact that they had beaten the soldiers. Of course, these 3 whips also meant that they had severed all ties with the past. It meant that from today onwards, they were no longer part of the Jurchens and Mongol cavalry. Instead, they were part of the mercenaries. At this moment, Yang Qindong was meeting the 2 of them in a large hall to talk about this matter. Over the past 3 to 4 days, although the 2 generals would be tied up and sent to the square early in the morning, they still understood what the mercenaries were like. This was a quality that a general must have, which was to be good at observation. It was precisely because of what they saw and observed that they admired the mercenaries from the bottom of their hearts. In their opinion, if their side had achieved such a great victory, it would have been impossible for them to enter Narcissus Town without disturbing or bullying the citizens. Not to mention, over the past 3 to 4 days, not only did the mercenaries not harm a single civilian, they even went into the homes of the civilians after training to chop firewood, fetch water, and do other things within their capabilities. This kind of army had never appeared since ancient times. It was precisely because of this that they quickly won the hearts of the people of Narcissus Town. As a result, many people were thinking that it would be best if the 5-star army stayed here forever and never left. Being personally received by Yang Qindong already proved the value of the 2 generals. Originally, the 2 of them didn't like some of Borte's and Bagan's methods. Now that the 2 of them were still being tortured in the square, death was inevitable and there would be a painful process. So, where should the 2 of them go from here? Yang Qindong's appearance expressed his intention to recruit them. With sincerity, the 2 generals only hesitated for a moment before kneeling down and calling him the 6th young master. This meant that from this moment onwards, they had completely joined the mercenaries' camp. Whether it was Hu Lu or Tai Mu'er, they were both quite strong. However, they were only not bad. It would be a lie to say that they were military geniuses. The reason why Yang Qindong was willing to come was because of their understanding of the local situation and their role as role models among the Jurchens and Mongol cavalry. This time they had captured 7,000 captives. Among them, there were 3,500 Jurchens and 2,500 Mongol cavalry. These were all people who dealt with war horses all year round. These soldiers only needed a little training before they could go on the battlefield. Naturally, the more such soldiers the better. Not only these 7,000 captives, Yang Qindong also had no intention of letting the 8,000 strong men in Narcissus town go. If possible, of course, he wanted to recruit them as subordinates. The more the better. Before doing this, he wanted to ask for Hu Lu and Tai Muer's opinion. After all, they were the local bullies. They should understand the situation better than he did. This was also the main reason why Yang Qindong wanted to meet the two of them. Both Hu Lu and Tai Muer naturally wanted to perform well and leave a good impression on their commander. At that moment, the two of them spoke one after another. From the two of them, Yang Qindong learned about the situation between the Jurchens and the Mongol army. For example, the Jurchens were divided into two types, the Jurchens and the matured Jurchens. Under normal circumstances, the matured Jurchens were more inclined towards the Han people because they had lived with them for many years. The Jurchens, on the other hand, were more fond of war and conquest. This was why the Jurchens were mostly the Jurchens who ruled. For example, Borte was one of the representatives of the Jurchens. In Narcissus town it was the exact opposite. There were more matured Jurchens. If it wasn't for the harsh living conditions, most of them wouldn't have joined the army and would have lived a simple life like the Han people. This was Hu Lu's analysis as a member of the Jurchens. Next, the Mongol general Tai Muer talked about Mongolia. Mongolia was just a general term. After the fall of northern Yuan in 1402, Mongolia was divided into many tribes. Later on, it gradually formed into three major tribes according to the area they lived in. The Mongols who lived in the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region and the three northeastern provinces were called the Southern Desert Mongols, or the Horkan tribe. The Mongols who lived in present-day Mongolia were called the Northern Desert Mongols, or the Khalkha tribe. The Mongols who lived in Xinjiang, Qinghai and Gansu were called the Western Desert Mongols, or the Oirat tribe. Between the three major tribes there were many smaller tribes. They would often have disputes over territory and interests, which led to all kinds of wars. In short, there was only one word to describe it: chaos. Often, two small tribes that had a good relationship with each other yesterday might suddenly start fighting against each other today after they had just reached an alliance. For example, Bagan was once the son of a small tribe's chief. Because his tribe was annexed by others, he had no choice but to bring some of his remaining soldiers to Narcissus town and develop there. Previously, Borte had been worried that if he touched Bagan, the Mongolian cavalry would retaliate. That was simply impossible. He was just scaring himself. Or rather, Bagan was a person who knew how to take advantage of the situation. Whether it was Hu Lu's or Tai Muer's words, it was consistent with the investigation report sent by the Security Bureau. This proved that the two of them had no intention of playing tricks with him. Yang Qindong was naturally very happy. He blurted out, "Based on your opinions, if I wanted to recruit and expand my army here, how many people would be willing to join the 5-star army?" In order not to attract the attention of Baiming Walla or even the Mongolians, Yang Qindong planned to use the name of the 5-star army before he developed enough strength in this area. Once the time was right or he couldn't hide it anymore, he would use the name of mercenaries again. In order to set an example, Yang Qindong naturally only mentioned the 5-star army when he spoke. After saying that, he looked at Hu Lu and Tai Muer with a smile, waiting for their reply. In his heart, he honestly didn't care about the revenge of the Jurchens and the Mongolian cavalry. He would just deal with whatever came his way. Other than the fact that he didn't have enough military strength, he was already ahead of other armies in all other aspects. What was there to be afraid of? No problem. Facing this question, Hu Lu and Tai Muer didn't hesitate at all. They were even a little excited when they answered the question. Although it was true that they had decided to join the 5-star army, and with their bravery, it shouldn't be a problem for them to become an officer. However, if they could recruit more captives and civilians from Narcissus town and let them join the army, it would be more beneficial for them to quickly establish their prestige since they were already familiar with each other. After all, everyone was familiar with each other. If they wanted to achieve the goal of taking care of each other, who would look for strangers when there were people they were familiar with? Haha, good. Yang Qindong nodded in satisfaction. He could see through Hu Lu and Tai Muer's thoughts, but he didn't care. As long as these thoughts didn't affect the overall situation, he would allow them to exist. Since that's the case, I'll have to trouble the two of you to cooperate with Commander Wu Xing, Political Commissar Chen Bo, and Commander Zhui Feng in recruiting soldiers. Chapter 656. Yang Qindong did indeed want to recruit soldiers. Not only that, he also wanted to establish a cavalry division. After obtaining so many war horses, he felt that the time was ripe. What army was the strongest in the grasslands? Naturally, it would be the cavalry. He naturally wanted to cooperate and establish a powerful cavalry force. The cavalry division would be temporarily held by Wu Xing, and Qin Bo would be the political commissar. The Windchaser cavalry regiment also needed to be expanded. However, it wasn't suitable to establish a cavalry division at the moment. It would be called the Cavalry Reinforced Regiment for now. The number of soldiers under it was equivalent to 2 cavalry regiments. It could be considered below a division and above a regiment. In fact, this unit could also be called a brigade. However, Yang Qindong didn't want to go through so much trouble. He might as well just create a cavalry reinforced regiment. Now that the main theme had been set, the next step was to recruit soldiers. Because of the previous 3 days of public trial and the fact that the 5-star army had already gotten along well with the commoners during this period of time, their relationship was extremely good. Naturally, there wouldn't be any problems with the recruitment of soldiers. On the contrary, because there were too many applicants, they had no choice but to use the method of selecting the best. Compared to the other armies that needed to recruit strong men from all over the place and promise them great benefits in order to barely gather enough soldiers, this kind of upsurge of people signing up to join the army would definitely make those people jealous if they knew about it. This was the use of role models. This was the use of words and example. When you truly saw the commoners as human beings and gave them the respect and dignity they deserved, you would discover that their cute side would be revealed. They would truly think for you and be willing to give you everything they had. Of course, this was also related to the generosity of the 5-star army. Compared to the recruitment of the Nuzan and Mongol cavalry, the monthly salary was only 2 taels of silver and 5 kilograms of meat. Later on, the Mongol army purposely increased the salary to 5 taels of silver and 20 kilograms of meat. The 5-star army directly gave out 10 taels of silver. Once they proved that their fighting ability had reached the 1st rank, the salary would be increased to 15 taels of silver. This was equivalent to 5 times the original salary. The treatment was good and they could obtain respect. In addition, the 5-star army had just gotten justice for everyone. This caused the craze of people signing up to join the army to become extraordinarily lively. Out of the 7,000 cavalrymen who were captured, 6,500 of them were willing to join the 5-star army. Out of the 8,000 strong men in Narcissus Town, 7,500 of them signed up. That was to say, as long as Yang Qindong was willing to accept all of them, the number of new soldiers would increase by 14,000. Based on the calculation of 400 soldiers per battalion, there would be an additional 35 battalions. If it were any other army or force, they would definitely be very happy. However, in Yang Qindong's eyes, he did not have the intention to take over all of them. What he wanted were elite soldiers who could fight and not an ordinary army that was just there to make up the numbers. Luo Po's 2nd Cold Front Regiment remained in Laos and Vietnam, preparing to expand into 2nd Cold Front Regiment. Based on this foundation, Yang Qindong made preparations to expand Wu Xing's 3rd Regiment into a cavalry division. There would be 3 regiments under his command, and each regiment would be expanded from the original 4 battalions to 5 battalions. The 5th battalion would be the preparatory battalion. In this way, the number of people in a regiment would be 1,600. 3 regiments plus a division of 400 men. In total there were about 5,200 men. Other than the cavalry division, there was also a need to build a reinforced cavalry regiment. Zhui Feng and Lu Zhuo would be the commanders of the 1st and 2nd regiments. Since it was a reinforced regiment, the organization of the regiment naturally had to be strengthened as well. A battalion would be divided into 6 companies, so 3 battalions would be a total of 1,800 people. Including the 2 companies directly under the regiment, a reinforced regiment would have a total of 2,000 people. 2 reinforced regiments would have 4,000 people. The original 6 auxiliary battalions would become an independent regiment with a total of 2,400 people. For the time being, Yang Qindong would personally lead it, and Tiger's Mane would be the regiment commander. In this way, one cavalry division had 5,200 people, 2 cavalry regiments had a total of 4,000 people, and 1 auxiliary soldier had a total of 2,400 people. In total, there were about 11,600 people. This was already not a small force and not a weak force. In order to fulfill this condition, he would need to recruit 6,600 people. This meant that out of the 14,000 people who signed up, he would only accept 6,600 new recruits. This meant that he would have to eliminate more than half of the people. When the news came out, the middle-aged and middle-aged men of Narcissus Town were stunned. Then all of them worked hard to perform well and fight for the chance to join the 5-star army. Although the 5-star army was different from other armies and they even rejected people who signed up, didn't this mean that they were strong? An army that accepted all kinds of people might seem to have a lot of people, but when it came to war they wouldn't be as strong and powerful as they looked. On the other hand, the 5-star army was the true representative of strength. One must know that not everyone was like them, who dared to say no to the middle-aged men who wanted to join the army. The order was given by Yang Qindong, so naturally no one would object. Next was the conscription test. The examiners would set the questions, which were horsemanship test, horsemanship battle, and strength on land. Everyone wanted to perform well. After all, if they could join the 5-star army, not only would it be a chance to prove themselves, but it would also give them an enviable monthly salary. There would be face and benefits, so naturally everyone would fight to the death. Sacha River City. Sacha River was only a small town next to the Songhua River. However, due to its special geographical location, there was still a Baiming Qianhu. Qianhu Wei's surname was Yila. He was a standard Nuzan tribe member and belonged to the Nuzan branch. At this moment, Yila was receiving Hui Libu, who escaped from Narcissus Town, in his Qianhu residence. Everyone was a Nuzan and belonged to the Nuzan branch, so naturally they kept in contact. Hui Libu would even come to Sacha River to deliver gifts under General Borte's orders during the holidays. However, this time he came alone. He didn't even ride a horse. Yila was very curious about Hui Libu's sudden arrival and his down-and-out appearance. However, when he heard about what happened in Narcissus Town, Yila couldn't help but frown. After some time he asked in a very serious tone, "You said that the 5-star army stole 2,000 war horses from the Jian province left guard. Is that true? I know you want to return to Narcissus Town for revenge, but please remember that some things can't be said carelessly. Not only will you lose your head, but you will also implicate the Nuzan people in the army." "General Yi, I can vouch for this with my head. The 5-star army was the one who stole the Jian province left guard. This is no secret in Narcissus Town." She puffed out her chest and raised her head. She didn't have the slightest intention of backing down. She patted her chest and made a promise. He stared at Hui Libu seriously, but the latter's gaze was still as resolute as ever. Finally, Yila let out a long sigh. "All right, if what you said is true, then this is equivalent to making a great contribution to Northern Ming. I will immediately report this matter to the higher-ups. Once the 5-star army is eliminated, the territory of Narcissus Town will be yours." "Thank you, General." Hui Libu's face was filled with joy and excitement. He didn't forget to make a promise. "Don't worry, General. Once I take control of Narcissus Town, the previous rules won't change. I still have to rely on your help." The so-called rules naturally referred to the filial piety during festivals. However, Yila didn't care about that at this moment. He was thinking about how to use this matter to raise his status in the new Ergon-Dusi region and how to expand his power. Female Zhenren, especially Xingnu Zhenren, were naturally good at fighting. The generals of Baiming had already seen this. Therefore, more and more female Zhenrens were being promoted. Some became Baihu, some became Vice Jianhu, and Yila became a Major Qianhu. It seemed that a Major Qianhu would have a bright future. However, only he knew how difficult it was for a female Zhenren to squeeze into the group of people with the highest authority. To do this, not only did he need the support of nobles, but he also needed enough military achievements. The appearance of the 5-star army seemed to give him an opportunity. If possible, perhaps he could use this matter to help him reach a higher position. It was no wonder that Yila thought this way. In history, more than 100 years ago, Nur Hasai, who was born in the Jian province left guard commander's family, used the 13 sets of armor left behind by his ancestors to start his journey of establishing a country and becoming a Khan. This person's ancestor was once a high-ranking official in the Ming army. It could be said that Yi Lei's idea was correct. Unfortunately, this time he was going to face the mercenaries, and the mercenaries personally led by Yang Chendong, which would be destined to be a futile effort. Of course, he didn't know this at the moment. After receiving the uncertain information, he immediately informed the nearby guard stations, especially the Jian province left guard, who immediately sent out scouts to inform them. Not only that, Yi Lai also contacted the vice Jinhu of the Taining Guard, Lu Dai, who was closer to him. This person was also a female Zhenren. He wanted to go to Narcissus Town with this person. If there was a chance, they would take down the 5-star army in one fell swoop. If not, they would join forces with the Jian province left guard to attack the 5-star army. As the scouts rode out of the city, the southwest area of the new Urgan metropolis became lively. A large net that covered and targeted the 5-star army slowly unfolded. Some people said that the new Urgan metropolis was a recruitment organization sent out by the Liaodong metropolis. This organization's mission was to recruit the female Zhenren tribe. Whether or not there was a metropolis didn't affect the Ming dynasty's control over the various guard stations. In some people's eyes, the new Urgan metropolis was just an administrative area. It wasn't even an organization. Chapter 657. Was that right? Yes and no. Yes, that was because history had indeed developed this way. However, with the appearance of Yang Chendong, history had already deviated from its original path. Baiming's emperor Zhu Xian had only limited his influence to the north. This gave him more energy to control the new Urgan Dusi region. Ever since Zhu Xian started doing this, not only did Baiming's control over this place become stronger, but the garrison here was no longer useless. The number of soldiers had also increased by a lot. This made this place Baiming's recruitment warehouse. If there was a war with the southern Ming Empire one day, there would be an endless stream of soldiers being sent to the front lines. However, such a conscription warehouse was actually tricked by someone else. It was imaginable how furious the generals of the various guard posts would be when they heard this news. This was no longer riding on a tiger's head, but riding on a tiger's head and shitting on it. This was intolerable. Yella also saw through this, so when he spread the news, a huge net had been set up to target the 5-star army. A huge war was unavoidable. Narcissus Town. After 3 days of public hearings and 7 days of conscription examinations, 6,600 new recruits had been selected and were officially assigned to the various divisions and battalions. More than 6,000 people had joined all of a sudden. This number was much more than the original mercenary army and 5-star army. This unavoidably lowered the 5-star army's combat ability and even pushed the mercenary army, which was a first-class army, down to a second-class army. This was the pain of expanding the army. It was unavoidable. Fortunately, with Yang Chendong's leadership, as long as they went through the baptism of war, he believed that the 5-star army would definitely shine brightly and become a first-class army again. After staying in Narcissus Town for 12 days, the team of close to 12,000 people finally had to leave. Before he left, Yang Chendong left behind many weapons he had seized from the Borte tribe and Bagan tribe. According to him, there were close to 8,000 young adults and 50,000 civilians in Narcissus Town. They belonged here and had the right to defend their rights, so he left these weapons for them to use in forming their own army. Yang Chendong believed that with weapons in Narcissus Town, no one would take the initiative to bully them as long as they were united against external threats. Of course, a person's path still had to be walked by themselves. Yang Chendong could not take care of them forever. Perhaps one day he would point his army at the new Urgan prefect, and the civilians would really be liberated. Yang Chendong did not know how long he would have to wait for that day. However, he was clear that his current mission was to get to the Walla region. If they were able to fight evenly with Baiming, he would not attack. Instead, he would head northeast to test the strength of the Mongolian cavalry. If possible, he would go north to the Golden Horde. That was also ruled by the Mongolians and would be the Russian region in the future. As a country that spanned across the Eurasian continent, Russia had yet to rise. It had already lived under the rule of the Mongols for more than 200 years. In history, the Golden Horde was in a period of decline. Taking advantage of this opportunity to occupy this place and prevent the unborn Russia from ever appearing again was one of the main reasons he brought his army here. Of course, before doing this he had to balance the military strength of northern Ming and Vala. Only when they were balanced and kept each other in check would he be able to free himself to deal with the Mongolian issue. Otherwise he was afraid that he would have to make a move on the stronger side. After all, no matter if it was Walla or Baiming, Yang Qindong did not want either of them to become stronger. With a goal in mind, they followed the military plan and headed west to the Walla region after leaving Narcissus Town. Compared to before they entered Narcissus Town, the 5-star army was a lot stronger. When they walked on the main road they looked a lot more majestic. It was obviously difficult for such an army to hide their tracks, so they were quickly targeted by the Baiming cavalry from Saha River City and Taining City. This time Chiliarch Yella personally led 300 cavalry from the Saha River Guards. Along with him were 300 cavalrymen from Peaceful City, led by Vice Qianhu Lu Dai. A total of 600 cavalry followed behind the 5-star army. If they were slow they would be slow. If they were fast they would be fast too. It was obvious that they could not beat them, but they would definitely bite them to death. The news of the sudden appearance of Baiming cavalry was immediately sent to Yang Qindong, who was on his white dragon horse. Reconnaissance Battalion Commander Su Yunxing, who was also riding on a horse, came to Yang Qindong's side. Thanks to the expansion of the army, he had filled up another battalion and returned to his position as battalion commander. 6th Young Master, we have already asked around. The ones following us are Baiming cavalry from the Saha River Guards and Taining City. They have a total of 600 cavalry. Oh right, the 2 Kiliarchies leading the troops are called Yella and Lu Dai. They are both Nuzan. I heard from the captives that they are very good at fighting, Su Yunxing said excitedly. Although both Yila and Lu Dai were very careful, if they wanted to follow the 5-star army, they would have to send out scouts to follow them. Just 2 hours ago Su Yunxing had used the 95 style to injure 2 enemy scouts on horseback. From their mouths, he had hurriedly rushed over to report the situation to them. 600 cavalry? Nuzan generals. Yang Qindong's lips twitched into a smile. Looks like news of what happened in Narcissus Town has already spread. They should already know that we were the ones who stole over 2,000 war horses from Jian Province, Northern Guard and Northern Guard. Su Yunxing was originally feeling smug about getting some information about the enemy, but after hearing Yang Qindong's analysis he was naturally confused. 6th Young Master, that shouldn't be. We did everything cleanly from the beginning to the end. Although many people in Narcissus Town know about this, we just left. The news shouldn't have spread so quickly, right? Nothing is absolute. Who knows if there are other channels in Narcissus Town that can spread the news to the outside world. Yang Qindong shook his head. He would never underestimate any enemy, nor would he think that he was the smartest person. Because anyone who did this would not live long. There was nothing wrong with thinking the best of things but preparing for the worst. All right, increase the number of scouts at the front. If I'm not wrong, there should be people waiting for us at the Liao River area in front of us. His tone was neither hurried nor slow, but his attitude was very firm. Su Yunxing was very puzzled when he saw all this. How did the 6th Young Master know that there would be enemies waiting for them ahead? He was the leader of the scouts, okay? However, since this was what the 6th Young Master said, Su Yunxing naturally could not object. He only agreed with a dubious thought and rode off. Liao River was a large river that blocked the path of the 5-star army. There were only 2 ways to enter the Walla area from Narcissus Town. One was to go north over the mountains and cross the Daxing and mountain range, or go west and cross the Liao River. Considering that the army was now all cavalry, passing through a primitive forest like the Daxing and mountain range was extremely difficult. In the end, Yang Qindong made a decision and decided to take the Liao River. However, if they wanted to pass through the Liao River, they would definitely have to return to the territory under the Jian Province Guard's jurisdiction. It would not be easy for so many troops to take the path. It was very likely that a great battle would be unavoidable. Fortunately, Yang Qindong had already made preparations for this. He wanted to train his troops, and what was the best way to increase an army's combat strength? Of course, it was a great battle to his heart's content. It could be said that when Yang Qindong chose to enter the Walla through the Liao River, he had already made preparations for a battle with the Baiming army. However, what he never expected was that because he wasn't able to return, the news was leaked ahead of time. Right now, at the Liao River, it wasn't just the nearby Baiming's 30,000 guards that were waiting for him. The Jian Province Left Guard, Maolian Guard, Twin City Guard, Jian Province Guard and Shenyang Central Guard that received the news had already sent troops, or they had already hurried to the northern source of the Liao River, or were currently hurrying over. The scouts sent out by the reconnaissance battalion quickly received this news. After compiling the information and sending it to Battalion Commander Su Yunxing's hands, it was then sent to Yang Chendong. At this moment when Battalion Commander Su looked at Yang Chendong, his eyes were full of admiration and respect. Without any reference or data, completely relying on intuition and guesses to predict the next step of the situation. What was there to be scared of when following such a meticulous commander? Yang Chendong didn't reveal a trace of arrogance. Instead, he carefully read the information gathered by the reconnaissance battalion. The Twin City Guard had 300 infantrymen, the Maolian Guard had 300 infantrymen, and the Jian Province Left Guard had 2,000 infantrymen led by Commander Tang Longtian. In addition, the Jian Province Guard had 2,000 cavalrymen and 1,000 infantrymen led by Commander Sun Hong. The Shenyang Central Guard had 2,000 cavalrymen and 1,000 infantrymen led by Commander Zhu Dahai. In addition to the Liao River Guard and the Saga River Guard and Taining Guard that were following behind, there were around 5,000 cavalrymen and 5,000 infantrymen. This was a total of 10,000 enemies. For them to suddenly deploy such a force, it was clear that they wanted to seek justice for the 2,600 horses that were stolen from the Jian Province 3 guards. Could they really scare him with just these people? If it was before he went to Narcissus Town, he might have been a little afraid. But now Yang Chendong's strength had also grown. He had 12,000 men under him and all of them were cavalrymen. They had the best war horses, the best weapons and even the strongest combat power. Even with the addition of nearly 7,000 men, Yang Chendong could still confidently say that the mercenary army was still a first-class army. With the addition of powerful war horses, they could completely overcome the weakness of having a large number of new recruits. Chapter 658. On the other hand, although these northern Ming guards had been established for quite some time, they were limited by their environment and had not experienced any great battles. With their short-sightedness, it was easy for them to have an arrogant attitude of thinking that the heavens were number 1, the earth was number 2 and they were number 3. This was the time to teach them a good lesson. Calm and collected, full of vigor. After Yang Chendong digested the information and firmly memorized it in his heart, he raised his head again. At this moment, his face was still filled with confidence and his gaze was incomparably firm. Pass down the order, summon all the regiments and regimental commanders for a meeting. As they marched, Yang Chendong met with Wuxia and the other regimental commanders to confirm that they would not change their route. They had made the final decision to fight the Baiming guards head-on. What was worth mentioning was that Yang Chendong's troops were not without other options. For example, they could turn back now. Instead of going through the Liao River, they could go through the Dixing and mountain range. Although the path would not be easy to traverse, they could completely avoid the northern Ming guards. However, no one had expressed this intention since the beginning of the meeting. It was as if this choice did not exist. In the eyes of these regimental commanders, they only had one thought, and that was to kill, kill and kill again. After deciding to fight the Baiming guards head-on, the next step was to mobilize the troops before the battle. In order to maximize the strength of the Jurchens and Mongolians who had just joined, Yang Chendong said that for every enemy they killed, every enemy's nose would be awarded 1 point and 10 taels of silver. In ancient times there were many ways to record one's achievements. The most common way was to cut off the enemy's head to prove one's achievement. It was fine if one only killed 1 or 2 enemies, but if there were too many, one's entire body would be covered in heads. It would affect one's strength and it would still look too bloody. Yang Chendong suggested that the beheading should be changed to cutting off the nose, also known as cutting off the nose in ancient times. Once a person's nose was cut off, it was likely that not many people could continue to live. The so-called achievement was based on 100 points. Those who had more than 100 points were qualified to become an auxiliary soldier. Those who had more than 1,000 points were qualified to join the Cold Front. This was also Yang Chendong's tolerance towards the Jurchens and the Mongol cavalry. If it were any other alien race, no matter how great their contributions were, they would not be qualified to test Lung Feng. On the other hand, these two ethnic groups were heavily influenced by Han culture. If they were good material, he would not be stingy in polishing them. The rewards were passed down by the division commanders. When they found out that they could get 10 taels of silver for every enemy they killed, the Jurchens and Mongols as well as the Han riders who had just joined the water ferry town, were all excited. The reason why they were willing to leave their hometown with the 5-star army was because they had a good impression of the army, but more importantly, they wanted to use this platform to show their worth. What was value? Earning more military merits and earning more taels of silver was the most direct manifestation of this. For a moment they were all rubbing their fists. Whenever they had time, they would take out the whetstones they brought with them to sharpen the sabers in their hands even brighter and faster. The newcomers wanted to perform well and fight for the top prize. As veterans, Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers would not give in either. Over the past few days, although the cavalrymen from Narcissus Town looked at them with a hint of respect, it could be seen that the respect was due to envy and respect for the continuous fire guns in their hands. As for the combat power of the horses, it seemed like they were being looked down upon. This was something that the proud Lung Feng soldiers could not accept. What was the Lung Feng? It represented the strongest existence, the proudest existence. Once they appeared, they would become the focus of attention. How could they allow others to look down on them? This was a form of blasphemy to their identity. How could they make others respect them? Of course, they had to perform well on the battlefield. Therefore, after the mobilization before the battle, Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers had been training non-stop apart from sleeping and traveling. Getting on the horse, getting off the horse, slashing, increasing speed, dodging and other movements were all trained tirelessly. Unknowingly, their strength improved bit by bit and became stronger. Compared to the hard work of Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers, and compared to the sharpening of the cavalry, the Baiming armies camped by the Liao River was very relaxed. Ever since they came to the newer Gandusi region, the Baiming guards had become the ruler here. Especially when the other factions were still very weak and had not been able to rise up, they were the sky here, the boss here. Since they were the boss, of course they had a sense of superiority. They only needed to point their weapons at a place and that place would have to submit. This seemed to have become an iron law. As time passed, they got used to being high above others and used to bullying others. The more they were like this, the more dissatisfied they were with the 5-star army's actions. They did not have any ideas about the 5-star army, but instead they were targeted and tricked by someone else. How could they face this? If they did not get back at them, how could they face others in the future? The 5-star army had to pay the price. This was something they had all come to a consensus. As a result, the Jian Province Left Guard, Jian Province Guard and Shenyang Central Guard all sent out their troops. 5,000 cavalry and 5,000 infantry. In their eyes, this type of formation was enough to scare the 5-star army's legs until they went soft. Arrogant and condescending, it made many of the northern Ming soldiers who came here treat this official mission as a vacation. Even though the scouts at the front were continuously sending back news, even though there were scouts at the front that had already been captured by the enemy, their side's formation should have already been known by the enemy. As the commanding generals of this battle, Jian Province Guard Commander Sun Hong, Shenyang Central Guard Commander Zhu Dahai, and Jian Province Left Guard Commander Tan Long Tian still had an appearance of victory in their grasp. Since you already know our strength, then you should feel even more fear, right? The three generals had this type of confidence. In reality, they also possessed great influence. This type of formation could scare many people without even fighting. For example, if this type of formation was placed in front of Borte and Ba Zhen, who had already been killed by 1,000 cuts, perhaps there really was no need to fight. They would have to consider surrendering or running away. This was precisely the powerful influence of the Baiming army. Meanwhile, this type of influence was established precisely during Emperor Zhu Di's reign. This emperor who relied on great strength to fight his way to power, developing the navy, conquering Mongolia in the north, conquering Jiaoji in the south, establishing great contributions. He also struck fear into the hearts of the other races around the Great Ming Dynasty. Once they heard that this was the Great Ming Dynasty's army, they would often collapse without a fight, defeat set in stone. Unfortunately, that was already in the past. The defeat of Tu Mu already indicated that the Great Ming Dynasty had fallen from its peak. If they did not change and did not work hard after 100 years, they would completely walk out of the stage of history. These were all things that Yang Chendong knew. These Baiming guards were still unaware, still living under the powerful halo of their ancestors, still waiting for the 5-star army to dismount and surrender. The ignorant were fearless. It was precisely because they did not think that the 5-star army was that powerful that they were destined to pay the heaviest price in the upcoming battle. 3 days later, the 5-star army finally appeared 20 miles away from the Liao River and quickly set up camp here. Smoke rose from the chimneys and the fragrance of meat permeated the air. There was a lot of meat, wine, cigarettes and other things that were prepared by Yang Chendong before he came to the Nuergon Dusi. The meat was cured and could guarantee that the meat would not spoil for a certain period of time. When the fragrance of the meat began to spread, the entire camp instantly became lively. Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers were better off as their meals were not bad. They could not eat hot food unless they were marching or fighting and needed to be hidden. If it was during normal times except for breakfast, there would be meat for almost every meal. They were used to it. On the other hand, the cavalrymen from Narcissus Town and the Windchaser cavalry were overjoyed. Most of them were young and this was the time when they could eat. Since there was enough meat, everyone was naturally prepared to have a big meal to satisfy their appetite. Of course, when the fragrance of the meat permeated the air, everyone knew very well that the war was about to begin. However, no one was nervous. Whether it was the battle-hardened Lung Feng, the Windchaser cavalry or the cavalrymen from Narcissus Town, they were all used to seeing life and death. To them, war was a process of death. The only difference was one's strength and luck. At the same time, war was also a process for them to reap rewards. Once they won, the benefits they received would be much greater than usual. As the saying went, wealth comes from danger. Needless to say, after witnessing the might of the continuous fire muskets in the hands of the Lung Vanguard and the shiny steel sabers in the hands of the Lung Vanguard, the auxiliary troops and the Windchaser cavalry, although they were envious, they also wanted to own such powerful and excellent weapons one day. At the same time, they were very confident. With such powerful comrades, what was there to be afraid of? Victory would definitely belong to them. The 5-star army finally arrived and set up camp 20 miles away. When the news reached the Baiming army's camp, the 3 generals in charge gathered together. However, there was no prepared sand table in front of them, and the 3 of them did not intend to sit down and discuss tactics. There was only meat and wine in front of them. The 3 of them ate and drank as they talked about their experiences. Most of the time they talked about the war between Baiming and Walla. Both sides suddenly fell out with each other. Then both sides stationed their troops at the border. After that they began probing each other. Once they got used to each other's tactics or figured out each other's strength, a huge battle would be unavoidable. Chapter 659. As part of the Baiming army, the 3 generals weren't nobodies. Today they were talking about the war over there. Who knew when they would be transferred to the front lines? Therefore, the 3 of them were talking about the situation over there. They ignored the 5-star army that had arrived in front of them. Even though the scouts had reported that there were more than 10,000 people on the other side and that they were all cavalry, the 3 generals still didn't take them seriously. Perhaps they already knew that the 5-star army was recruiting soldiers in Narcissus Town. From their point of view, how strong could a newly formed army that hadn't even gone through training yet be able to display such a strong combat strength? They were the Baiming army and represented the strongest country and army in the world. Why would they be afraid of a new army that hadn't undergone the baptism of the battlefield? However, they had quite a number of war horses. After defeating the 5-star army, the 3 generals could sit down and discuss how to divide them up. The 3 generals drank and chatted until they were a little tipsy. Only then did they disperse. Only then did Sun Hong, the commander of the Jian province guards, speak. General Zhu, General Tang, I hope that we can unite tomorrow and restore our glory. Yes, please rest assured, General Sunday. Zhu Dehai and Tang Longtun also cupped their fists with a serious look on their faces. Then they strode out of the tent. At this moment, the 3 of them didn't take tomorrow's battle seriously. In their opinion, it was like an adult beating a child. They usually didn't want to lower themselves to your level, but once they stretched out their arms, victory would be decided with a slap. The mercenary camp was also unusually quiet at this moment. Other than the soldiers on night duty, everyone else had already gone to sleep after eating their fill. There would be a big battle tomorrow, so everyone needed to conserve their energy. In Yang Qindong's commander's tent, there were still oil lamps that hadn't been extinguished. With that qi, Yang Qindong would often rest for 4 hours a day to ensure that he would be full of energy and vigor. At this time he was not sleepy yet. He was standing in front of the sand table and looking carefully. Even though he held another military meeting before dinner and discussed all the possible problems that should be prepared and might happen, he still wanted to verify if there was any negligence before the war. Perhaps some people would attribute all of Yang Qindong's achievements to Okura, but if it wasn't for his hard work and diligence, even if he could win, he wouldn't have made such great progress in less than 4 years. Young master, it's almost midnight. Go and rest. Tiger's Mane walked into the tent sleepily. He first patted Beta Persei, who was standing at the side waiting for orders, and told him to take the time to rest. Tiger's Mane then walked over to the sand table. You slept well. Yang Qindong raised his head and casually glanced at Tiger's Mane, who was walking over, then waved his hand. I'm not sleepy yet. I don't need anyone to serve me here. You can go and sleep a little longer. When Tiger's Mane came to Yang Qindong's side, he had already recovered his energetic appearance. No need, young master. I'll sleep after dinner. I've slept enough, hee. Then, after looking at the sand table, he asked curiously, Is there a problem? No. Yang Qindong straightened his body and lightly shook his head. Then, with a smile on his face, he said, I've made sufficient preparations. As long as nothing unexpected happens, the outcome of the battle will be decided. Accidents? It doesn't seem to rain tomorrow, right? Tiger's Mane said casually. After following Yang Qindong for so long, he already knew that weather changes could sometimes become an important factor to affect the battle. But when he walked out of his tent just now, he saw the sky full of stars. Presumably it would be a sunny day tomorrow. Of course there won't be rain. Yang Qindong continued to smile, and a confident light appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not only will there be no rain, it should be a sunny day tomorrow. How about this? You go and inform the soldiers to wake up later tomorrow morning. Let them sleep for 2 more hours. No. 3 hours will do. Yes. Tiger's Mane was stunned at first. He didn't understand why he had to wake up so late. But since it was the 6th young master's order, he would of course do his best to carry it out. But in his heart he thought, could it be because the troops didn't get a good rest during the march, so the soldiers were allowed to sleep a little longer? Actually, it wasn't just Tiger's Mane who thought this. The next morning, the other soldiers who woke up 3 hours later than usual all had the same thought. They slept for about 10 hours. Everyone was full of energy and didn't feel tired at all. The 6th young master felt sorry for them, but he didn't know that Yang Qindong had his reasons for doing this. The 10,000 soldiers of the Northern Bright Guards had indeed woken up very early in the morning. In fact, they were all woken up before the sky was completely bright. Although some of them didn't get enough sleep and were a little dissatisfied, when they thought about how the 5-star army had already appeared in front of them, even if they didn't take the initiative to attack, they would still fight back. In other words, there was bound to be a big battle today. Since that was the case, it didn't matter if they slept a little less. It wasn't just the soldiers. Even the commanding generals Sun Hong, Zhu Dahai and Tang Longtian woke up an hour earlier than usual. Afterwards they started a fire to cook, put on their armor and brought out their war horses. They were all ready for battle. The sky gradually brightened and the sun began to rise. Under the cloudless sky, it indicated that today would be a sunny day. Hee, the weather is good, but I don't know if the 5-star army's mood is good too. Sun Hong, who had already mounted his warhorse, looked at Zhu Dahai and Tang Longtian and laughed heartily. He had a relaxed expression on his face. The 2 generals naturally laughed along. At this moment they seemed to have already seen a large number of war horses being captured by them, and the scene of them achieving great military merits. Reporting, the 5-star army has begun to move. A troop of nearly 2,000 cavalry has already left their camp and is slowly approaching us. They are currently about 18 miles away from us. A scout rode his horse to the front of the 3 generals and quickly jumped off his horse and knelt on the ground as he reported. Are you going to make a move now? Good scout again. Hearing that the 5-star army was indeed going to attack, Sun Hong didn't think much of it. Everything was within their expectations. The 3 generals had already reached a consensus. Since the 5-star army had arrived at the Liao River, if they wanted to cross they would have to face them. At that time they would only have two choices: attack or defend. However, if they only defended, they wouldn't be able to get supplies for a long time. Thus, attacking was the most likely option. Now that they heard that the other party had sent out close to 2,000 cavalry, they naturally wouldn't panic. On the contrary, they were somewhat dissatisfied with the fact that they only sent out 2,000 soldiers. With such a small number, it wasn't even enough to fill the gaps between their teeth. The scout obeyed the order and turned around to scout again. After the time it took for an incense stick to burn, another scout returned and reported that the 5-star army's cavalry was only 12 miles away from them. After such a long time, they only managed to run 8 miles. The 5-star army's cavalry is too slow. This time, without waiting for Sun Hong to express his opinion, Shenyang Central Guard Commander Zhu Dehai had already laughed out loud. This person was slightly chubby. When he laughed, his warhorse seemed to be greatly pressured as it paced back and forth a few steps. The armor on his body also trembled along with his laughter. It looked quite comical. Not bad. The 5-star army's cavalry is too slow. It seems like there's nothing to worry about. Sun Hong laughed and nodded. At this moment he was even more confident in this battle. After hearing Commander Sun Hong and Commander Zhu Dehai's words, the other Qianhu and Baihu commanders beside them all nodded. The commander of the Jianzhou Left Guard, Tang Longtian, directly shouted, "Inform the soldiers to be alert and prepare to face the enemy." The Beiming City Guard soldiers who were originally standing by the river lazily were all alerted by their superiors. Some of them held large swords, some of them held shields, some of them held bows and arrows, some of them held spears, and some of them prepared barricades. They all began to move. They were only waiting for the 5-star army's cavalry to appear so that they could teach them a lesson. 20 miles away in the 5-star army's camp, the soldiers had a good night's sleep. After eating a nutritious breakfast, they began to wait for the order to march. In the command tent, after waiting for the regimental and battalion-level officers to walk in one by one, they stood in 2 rows and looked at Yang Chendong, who was sitting at the head of the table. After looking at each officer, Yang Chendong, who was originally serious, suddenly smiled and explained, "The plan has changed. The time of the attack has been extended to 2 hours, but I don't know if everyone is ready now." Reporting to the 6th young master, "The preparations are complete. We can attack at any time." The officers were full of energy as they spoke. Good. Influenced by his words, Yang Chendong nodded his head in satisfaction. Then he looked at Su Yunxing, the commander of the reconnaissance battalion, and asked, "How are the Bugs, Northern Ming cavalry scouts, being dealt with? Have the 1st and 2nd regiments set off according to the plan?" Su Yunxing, who was called, stood up straight and raised his head. He was full of energy as he said, reporting to the 6th young master, 32 Beiming were killed an hour ago. Commander Wu and Political Commissar Chen have already set off according to the plan. They should arrive at the designated location in 2 hours and launch the attack. Beautiful. Yang Chendong snapped his fingers and looked at Su Yunxing. The reconnaissance battalion did a good job. After this mission is completed, you will be the first to receive the credit. Now I have another mission for you. You can take care of the 600 cavalry soldiers that are tailing us. Chapter 660. When Su Yunxing heard that he could obtain a 1st merit, his face was already filled with excitement. Now that he heard that there was a battle to fight, he immediately stood at attention in excitement. 6th young master, please rest assured. I will definitely complete the mission. With regards to Su Yunxing, Yang Chendong was still very reassured. Up until now, whenever a mission was given to him, there was not a single time where it was not completed well. Knowing that the Beiming cavalry behind him would not cause any trouble, his gaze once again fell on Zhui Feng and Lu Zhuo. Then he used an encouraging tone and said, "This time the 3 divisions will only be cooperating in battle. Only your 2 reinforced regiments will be the main force. This is also the first time you guys are going to battle since the expansion. I hope that you guys will be able to produce a perfect result. This young master also has great confidence in you guys. Now go and prepare for battle." After saying this, Yang Chendong intentionally raised his hand to look at his watch. The attack will begin at 10:30 in the morning. You guys have less than an hour to prepare. Yes. Zhui Feng and Lu Zhuo simultaneously gave a military salute. Then they led their respective battalion commanders out of the command tent. Next, it was time to use actions to perform. No matter how beautiful the words were, it was better to do things well and fight the battle well. In the blink of an eye, the large tent became empty. Seeing that there was no one else around, Tiger Mane could not help but come to Yang Chendong's side. Young master, you see that they all have a mission. The auxiliary barracks can't always be idle. The 6 battalion commanders have already reported to me. They also want to contribute and go to the battlefield. According to the original plan, the auxiliary barracks really had nothing to do with this battle. Their main mission was to take care of the logistics and the resources in their hands. When they first came to Sea Town from the sea, they brought a lot of resources. If anything happened to them, then the food and water of the army would become a problem. However, Yang Chendong could understand Tiger Mane's feelings. After the expansion of the army, the 6 auxiliary battalions were placed under his direct control. Later on, he gave the authority to Tiger Mane to train his abilities. This made Hu Mang so happy that he almost choked. As Yang Chendong's closest and most trusted person, he had a lot of power. Not only did the 2 guards have to listen to him, even the other division commanders had to be respectful when they saw him. But after all, he had never led an army before. This was his regret. Now it was all right, the young master had helped him make up for this regret. Now that he had 6 auxiliary barracks in his hands, if there was a big battle, he definitely wouldn't be able to participate, so there was no need to mention how anxious he was. Yang Chendong pondered for a moment. Since he wanted to train his Tiger Mane, how could it be called training if he didn't go to the battlefield? Okay, then you can leave 2 of the 6 auxiliary battalions to watch over the resources. You can lead the other 4 battalions. But there is one condition. Let the 2 reinforced regiments charge first. You can only lead the charge 15 minutes after they charge out. Okay, I promise I won't lead the charge. Tiger Mane seemed to be afraid that Yang Chendong would go back on his word, so he hurriedly stood at attention. Then he ran out of the command tent with a smile. Although the order to attack was the last, no matter what, it was still a chance to lead the troops. This was already a big breakthrough for him. Beiming Garrison Camp. The infantry and cavalry were separately preparing for defense. According to the plan, they would first block the first wave of attacks from the 5-star army, then the cavalry would suddenly charge out and completely defeat the 5-star army. The development of reality was very smooth at first. There were already scouts who reported that the 5-star army was moving towards them. Although there were less than 2,000 cavalry, it was enough for them to prepare for battle. What they didn't expect was that when the previous scout reported that the enemy was less than 12 miles away, the next scout reported that the 5-star army suddenly stopped and then retreated. They retreated? Sun Hong's face was filled with disbelief. He then looked at Zhu Dehai and Tang Longtian beside him. Zhu Dehai, who was being stared at by him, also had a face full of confusion. He could only find an explanation for himself. Could it be that they found something wrong? But that shouldn't be the case. We didn't prepare any ambush. They really didn't prepare any ambush. Perhaps in the eyes of the 3 generals, even if they were to face the 5-star army head-on, they still had enough confidence to defeat them. Even if the enemy's numbers were not less than theirs, even if the enemy was all cavalry, they still thought so. It had to be said that they were that confident. Oh no. It should be said that they were that arrogant. It was precisely because they didn't prepare any ambush that the 5-star army's sudden stop and subsequent retreat was so confusing. Just as the 3 generals were looking at each other, another cavalry scout reported that the 5-star army had started moving again, but it was obvious that they were moving at a very slow speed. What are they doing? Sun Hong was confused. This kind of advance, stop, retreat, and advance again. Moreover, the speed of the advance was very slow. It was really out of his expectations. It had to be said that he had led troops for many years, but not to mention seeing this kind of fighting method, it was the first time he had even heard of it. General Sun, do you think they are afraid? That's why they... Tang Longtian, the commander of the Jianzhou left guards, seemed to have suddenly thought of something and asked. After hearing Tang Longtian's explanation, Zhu Dehai, who was also at a loss, silently nodded his head. It seemed like this was a reasonable explanation. Otherwise, why would the enemy move forward and retreat in a completely different way from the norm on the battlefield? Haha. Sun Hong also believed that this was the result and immediately laughed out loud. Not bad, not bad. It seems like the enemy is really afraid. However, I believe that the general of the 5-star army is still very arrogant and wants to fight with us. Unfortunately, his soldiers are much smarter than him, so they are moving forward and retreating at the same time. Yes, it must be like this. If this is the case, victory is already on our side. Sun Hong was so happy and excited that Tang Longtian naturally laughed along with him. At the same time, he suggested an idea. General Sun, why don't we take the opportunity to kill our way out and seize victory while the enemy is hesitating? Sigh, no rush, no rush. Let them be anxious and afraid for a while. After a while, the time will be more ripe. At that time, we will be able to achieve victory in one go. Ah. Sun Hong laughed towards the sky, full of confidence. His laughter caused the surrounding generals to laugh as well. It was obvious that everyone's thoughts were the same as Sun Hong's. Amidst the laughter, the 3rd Regiment of the 3rd Cold Front Division was slowly advancing 10 miles ahead. Under the leadership of their regiment commander Chun Yang, their marching speed was extremely slow. It was already slower than walking by 5 minutes. The 1st Battalion commander Lu Qing rode beside Chun Yang, who was wearing a black cloak with an envious expression on his face. The cloak was indeed very cool. Wearing it would unknowingly make one look very cool. Unfortunately, the requirement was that only the regiment commander and above could wear a cloak. Lu Qing was only a battalion commander, and had just been promoted from a company commander after the expansion. At this moment he could only look at Chun Yang with envy. His gaze moved from the black cloak to Chun Yang. Lu Qing took the initiative to speak. Regiment commander, can we only lure the enemy this time? The division commander and the political commissar can lead the 1st and 2nd regiments into battle, right? Our mission. Lu Qing stopped halfway through his sentence. However, Chun Yang knew what he wanted to say. He turned his head to look at him and spoke in an extremely calm tone. We are in charge of luring the enemy. This is the military order of the 6th Young Master. Are you doubting the 6th Young Master? His voice wasn't very loud. In fact, only the two of them could hear him clearly. However, this sentence was enough to make Lu Qing's face turn pale. Cold sweat flowed down his body. No, I wouldn't dare. How could I doubt the 6th Young Master? Humph. Chun Yang knew that Lu Qing didn't have the guts to do so. Not only Lu Qing but also no one in the army would dare to think that way. Otherwise, the 6th Young Master wouldn't even need to make a move. Alright, completing the mission is what we need to do. As for killing the enemy, the higher-ups will naturally arrange it. Besides, the order is very clear. We can enter the battlefield, but we can't do it so quickly. We need to see the performance of the 1st and 2nd regiments first. We can only attack 15 minutes after they start attacking. So, save up your strength and perform well when the time comes. Yes, Regiment Commander. When the time comes, you will see the performance of the 1st Battalion. Lu Qing couldn't help but clench his fists. As a new battalion commander, he indeed needed to perform well in order to submit a perfect answer sheet. The conversation between the two came to an end. The two of them didn't have any doubts about the order they received. For example, why did they have to retreat after advancing for a while? For example, why did they have to slow down? Since it was an order given by the 6th Young Master, it must be correct and the most reasonable. In fact, it wasn't only Regiment Commander Chunyang who didn't think about this question. Even the other regimental commanders didn't think about this question. If they thought about it, they would think that the 6th Young Master delayed the attack in order to completely outflank the enemy. At this moment it was already noon. The sun was moving towards the highest point in the sky and began to roast the earth. 5-Star Army's main camp. When the clock pointed to 10:30, the regiment commander of the 1st Regiment Shui Feng and the 2nd Regiment commander Lu Zhua looked at each other and raised the sabers in their hands. Then 2 black cloaks rushed out. They each led 2,000 cavalrymen and rushed out of the camp. They directly charged towards the Baiming army 20 miles away. Chapter 661. While the 2 reinforced regiments were moving out, there were 2 groups of cavalry slowly approaching from the north and south of the Liao River. The ones leading them were the 3 RD Division's commander Wu Sheng and the division's political commissar Chen Bo. As division commanders, the color of their cloaks had already turned pure white, making them look much more handsome and valiant when they wore them. They had also become the symbol of the army. The 2 men walking at the front of the 2 groups looked at the time on their wristwatches as they walked. Thanks to the reconnaissance unit, They had excellent weapons that could kill enemies from hundreds of feet away. This allowed them to kill Baiming's scouts early on. Even when the two cavalry regiments arrived at the Liao River from the north and south, sealing off Baiming's left and right paths of retreat, the enemy still didn't notice. At this point, the first step of the mission was completed. The next step was to wait. When the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments suddenly appeared, they would seize the opportunity to attack Baiming's army from the flanks. They would break through their defenses and cause chaos in their ranks. This would help the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments gain control of the battle and obtain the final victory. In short, this time they would play the supporting role and help the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments complete the final attack. From this order alone, it could be seen that Yang Qindong had put a lot of thought into the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments. In order to increase their combat strength, he actually made the entire 3rd Division play the role of supporting troops. The time for the final attack was getting closer and closer. Wu Xing led the 1st Regiment to the north, while Qin Bo led the 2nd Regiment to the south. They had completely surrounded the Baiming army. Right at this moment, the ground began to tremble. The experienced cavalry knew that this was caused by a large group of cavalry approaching. At the front of the battlefield, Xue Feng and Lu Zhui each led a reinforced regiment and rushed over. During this time, they overtook the 3rd Division's 3rd Regiment that was in charge of attracting the enemy's attention. Then, without stopping, they rushed towards Baiming's main camp. In the center of Baiming's army, Sun Hong and the other generals also felt the ground tremble. The scouts in charge of gathering information also returned and reported that there were at least 4,000 to 5,000 5-star army cavalry rapidly approaching them. A great battle was on the verge of breaking out. It was inevitable. Sun Honggan sat on the horse without any panic. All of this was part of his plan. After all, in a battle between two armies, there would always be one side that would charge first. General Zhu, when the battle starts, please lead 2,000 infantrymen to attack the enemy from the left. This general will lead 2,000 cavalrymen to attack the enemy from the right. I'll have to trouble General Tang to take charge of the middle corps. Are you all okay with that? Sun Hong glanced left and right before his gaze landed on Generals Zhu Dehai and Tang Longtian. Even though Sun Hong's position was the highest among them, the commander of the Jian Province Guards, a major 3rd rank existence, while the other two were minor 3rd rank and major 4th rank military officials, both of them far inferior to him. But after all, they were not from the same institution. They could choose to listen to his arrangements, or they could choose to act on their own. This was the reason why he was so polite. Understood. Fortunately, before the great battle, the three of them had already sat down together to discuss tactics and tactics. They agreed that Sun Hong would be the leader, so now there naturally wouldn't be any problems. They cupped their fists and agreed. Very good. Then have the infantrymen make preparations to intercept the war horses. We have to stop them no matter what. Let these cavalrymen know just how insignificant their strength is when facing our Baiming's army, just how small their strength is and just how small their strength is. Meanwhile, with only one person blocking their first wave of attacks, the other side are all new recruits, so their morale will definitely take a hit. They won't be far from becoming a defeated army. Sun Hong's face was full of high spirits. This time they couldn't head to the front lines to fight Walla to the death, so they would just display their skills by the Liao River. After Sun Hong's voice fell, General Tang Longtian, who was in charge of commanding the infantrymen, immediately pulled out his sword and pointed it to the sky. He shouted loudly, "So infantrymen, listen to my orders and prepare for battle." A deafening sound began to ring out continuously. 1,000 shield-wielding soldiers with iron shields gathered in the center of the battlefield. From afar they looked like a black flood of steel, forming an iron wall, blocking the path of the 5-star army's cavalrymen. In front of this black iron wall, there were 1,000 Baiming soldiers setting up stakes and other objects. Behind the black iron wall, 1,000 archers also stood in rows, holding strong bows in their hands and carrying quivers of arrows on their backs. They looked like they were ready to draw their bows and shoot at any time to attack the 5-star army's cavalrymen. On both sides of the black iron wall, there were northern Ming soldiers armed with large sabers and long spears. Their mission was to charge forward like a dog that had seen a bone once an enemy fell off their horse and cut them into pieces in the shortest time possible. This was the formation used by Baiming infantrymen against cavalrymen. It was imitating the formation of the Southern Dynasty's founding emperor, Liu Yu. In the past, when facing the powerful Northern Wei cavalrymen, Liu Yu had 700 soldiers go ashore and the Yanhe River tribe set up hundreds of chariots to defend against the cavalrymen's charge. The two ends of the chariot formation were curved like a crescent moon. This was the formation that people loved to talk about. Because they didn't have chariots, the Baiming soldiers used stakes and shields to replace them. Although the effect might not be as good as long as they could block the first charge of the 5-star army cavalry, they would be in a stalemate. The cavalry led by General Sun Hong and General Zhu Dahai would then surround them from both sides. In the end, they would ambush the enemy cavalry from all sides and kill them. It could be said that the Baiming soldiers had made sufficient preparations this time. They looked like they wanted to hold back the 5-star army. If the cavalrymen weren't prepared, once they entered the formation, it would be very difficult for them to escape. However, the problem was that the 5-star army's cavalrymen weren't prepared. The Baiming army's formation had already been set up. Sun Hong and Zhu Dahai each led 2,000 cavalrymen to surround the enemy from both sides. The vanguard of the 5-star army's cavalrymen could be seen with the naked eye. They were constantly approaching the center of the battlefield and were getting closer and closer to the Baiming army's archers. Kill. Kill with me. Wei Feng took the lead. Just like his name, he became the vanguard of the charge. Even the 2nd Regiment's commander, Lu Zhua, was at least 200 meters away from him. Archers, get ready. Tang Longtian, who was in the middle of the formation, saw the enemy cavalrymen getting closer and closer. When they were about to enter the archers' shooting range, he raised his right arm and looked like he was ready to fire at any moment. The 1,000 Northern Ming archers also quickly drew their bows and aimed at the front. Once the order was given, they would release the arrows in their hands and kill the enemy. The atmosphere on the battlefield had become extremely tense. As the 5-star army's cavalrymen got closer and closer, the atmosphere became even more tense. It was like a taut bowstring that could break at any moment. This is the time. Blow the bugle call. Wu Sheng, who had already moved to the north and south sides of the Baiming army, used his binoculars to see all the movements on the battlefield. When he saw that the battle was about to begin, he gave the order to charge to the 5 officers who had been waiting for a long time. Beep 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 beep. The loud bugle call suddenly sounded and broke the silence between heaven and earth. Then the bugle call sounded and 3,000 cavalrymen suddenly charged into the battlefield from the north and south. They came to the sides and the back of the Baiming army. The sudden change caused Tang Longtian, who was in the middle of the formation, to turn around and look. When he saw that there were actually countless enemy cavalry appearing, he first said, "Not good," and then ordered his deputy beside him, Wang Tong of the 30,000 guards, to lead the remaining 300 cavalry to charge out and stop the cavalry of the 5-star corps that suddenly appeared behind them. General Sun Hong, who was riding on a horse to surround the 5-star army's cavalrymen, was also shocked by the huge formation behind him. He had a feeling of uneasiness just now. He kept thinking that something was wrong, but he couldn't figure it out. Now he finally understood. It turned out that he didn't receive any information from the scouts on both sides. He didn't even see them. It turned out that they were killed by the 5-star army. How did they do it? Those who could become scouts were smart and agile. It was understandable that 1 or 2 of them were killed. He sent out a total of 32 scouts on both sides. Why didn't any of them come back to report? A big question mark appeared in his heart. However, it wasn't the time to think about these things. What he needed to do now was to win in the chaos. Since there were already enemy cavalrymen behind him, even if he went back now, he wouldn't be able to avoid losses. He might as well go according to his original plan and kill them. As long as he could heavily injure or eliminate the 5-star army's cavalrymen, he would be able to retreat and deal with the enemy behind him. Originally, he wanted to wait for the enemy to enter the infantry formation. He wanted to wait until both sides were in a stalemate before making his move. But now it seemed that he couldn't wait anymore. Since that was the case, he could only attack first. Sun Hong quickly made a decision. The 2,000 cavalrymen who were originally moving slowly started to move under his command. They suddenly accelerated and charged towards the 5-star army's cavalrymen. But just as they rushed forward, an even bigger problem appeared. Strong rays of sunlight shone into their eyes, causing them to close their eyes involuntarily. They couldn't even see what was happening in front of them. How could they fight this battle? Sun Hong was also unable to see the situation in front of him because of the strong sunlight. He couldn't help but think in his heart, could it be that even the heavens want to take care of the 5-star army? How could he have known that Yang Chendong intentionally launched his attack 4 hours later? The effect was finally revealed. It was noon, so the side facing the sunlight would naturally suffer a great loss. This was also the reason why the cavalrymen of the 3 divisions would sometimes advance and sometimes retreat. They wanted to drag out the time until the sun was high up in the sky. When the sunlight was absolutely effective, they would launch their attack. In a situation where even the weather was taken into consideration, Sun Hong's charge naturally caused a huge problem. It was equivalent to announcing the outcome of the battle and even the death penalty for some people. Chapter 662. The sun is too bright, I can't see anything. Not good, I can only ride with my head down. I can't see the situation in front of me. The cavalry below had only just sped up when all sorts of questions were sent back. As the main general, Sun Hong had a bad feeling in his heart. He knew that it was time for him to make a decision. If he hesitated for even a moment longer, he would suffer irreparable losses. Retreat. Everyone retreat and regroup with the infantry. He knew that if they continued to charge forward, they wouldn't even be able to use 1/5 of their strength. How would they fight this battle? He immediately gave the order while turning his horse around. On the other side, Zhu Dahai also made the same decision as Sun Hong. He also led his troops towards the sun and similarly felt the blinding sunlight. He also knew that if they continued to fight, they would not be able to display their strength. Thus he decisively gave the order to retreat. Just like this, before they could complete the encirclement, before the battle even started, the 4,000 Baiming cavalry had no choice but to retreat. However, it was already too late for them to retreat. Behind them, the 3,000 cavalry from the 1st and 2nd regiments of the 3rd Division had already broken through the 300 cavalry led by Wang Tong. In front of 10 times the cavalry, Wang Tong had acted in a panic. After a single charge, Wang Tong was cut down on his horse by Wuxia, who was wielding a steel saber. With the death of their main general, the rest of the cavalry lost their morale. They put up a show of resistance and threw down more than 100 corpses before returning to the middle of the infantry. Behind these 100 over northern Ming dynasty cavalrymen, there were over 3,000 cavalrymen from the 5-star army. They urged their horses to chase after the northern Ming dynasty cavalrymen while shouting loudly. From time to time they would shoot arrows with the bows in their hands. Without any morale, the 100 or so Baiming cavalry didn't even have the strength to fight back. After throwing down more than half of the corpses, less than 80 of them made it back to the middle of the army. Before they could even gain a foothold, Wuxia and Qinbo had already led the 1st and 2nd regiments to kill their way behind them. Every time they raised their sabers, they would reap the life of an enemy soldier. At the front, Windchaser had already led a company of cavalry as the vanguard to kill Baiming's infantry. With their superb horsemanship, they leaped over the barricades on the ground and launched a series of fierce attacks on the shield-bearers. Due to the chaos at the rear, the 1,000 shield-wielding soldiers were already in disarray. The enemies at the front were also charging ferociously. Very quickly, some of the weaker Baiming infantry broke away from the formation. Every time this happened, they would be faced with the fall of a sharp saber, or the result of a person's head flying off with a raise of a saber. Following Zhui Feng's arrival, 1st Battalion Commander Deng Yu, 2nd Battalion Commander Gao Danhua, and 3rd Battalion Acting Battalion Commander Hu Lu's subordinates all followed behind. With the advantage in numbers and the speed of the steeds, the infantry shield-bearers, who were already riddled with holes, suffered heavy pressure again and again. Finally, their formation was thrown into chaos, and they were all separated and killed by the cavalry. Regiment Commander Lu Zhua of the 2nd Reinforced Regiment also rushed over. Seeing that the enemy's infantry were already in disarray and that it was only a matter of time before they were defeated, he turned his spear and aimed it at Zhu Dahai's 2,000 cavalry that were still retreating. Battalion Commander Ma in the middle, Battalion Commander Ding in the left, Battalion Commander Tay in the right. Everyone follow me and kill. Lu Zhua had been promoted from the Auxiliary Regiment Commander to the Cavalry Regiment Commander. He wanted to perform well, but at this moment, Zhu Dahai's troops had become his stepping stone. In addition, the 3 battalion commanders under him were also outstanding cavalry. For example, 1st Battalion Commander Ma Xiangshan, 2nd Battalion Commander Ding Shan, and 3rd Battalion Acting Battalion Commander Tai Mu'er were all people who had interacted with war horses for many years. He was very confident in their strength. Now that he had the opportunity, he naturally wanted to use his cavalry to attack his cavalry. He wanted to see the strength of his cavalry regiment. Cavalry against infantry, and with the advantage in numbers, even if he won, there was nothing to brag about. However, when cavalry fought against cavalry, it would be a battle of swords and spears. It would depend on one's ability. The originally proud Ma Xiangshan and the others wanted to perform well. With Lu Zhu's order, it could be said that it was exactly what they wanted. Immediately, the 2,000 cavalry of the reinforced regiment quickly changed direction and went straight for Baiming Zhu Dehai's troops who were still retreating. Zhu Dehai, who was retreating, let out a sigh of relief. They didn't have to face the sun anymore. This allowed his cavalry to display their original strength. As the main commander, he had more confidence in his heart. However, before he could fully recover from his shock, a large number of cavalrymen appeared in front of them. This cavalry unit was wearing all kinds of clothing. From afar there were Nuzan's clothing, Mongols' clothing, Han people's clothing, and even army green clothing. It could be said that there were all kinds of clothing. However, they all had one thing in common, and that was that each of them held a shiny saber in their hands, and each of them wore a pair of ink-black goggles that protected their eyes from afar. Naturally, the northern Ming cavalry would be at a disadvantage if they were to face the sun head-on. However, with the addition of the sunglasses, the 2nd Regiment was no longer a problem. The glare of the sun had been reduced infinitely and was placed at the side. Right now what they needed to do was to charge and charge. In the process of charging, the cavalry drew their bows and shot. As they approached, they shot the Baiming cavalry who were not fully prepared. Zhu Dehai's troops who were retreating had already lost their formation. Not to say that their formation was in chaos, but it was not too far off. Perhaps if they were given a certain amount of time, they could reorganize their troops. But would Lu Zhu give them time? One side was unprepared and the other side was ready. One side was retreating in panic and the other side was advancing bravely. Although the number of cavalry on both sides was the same, there were 2,000 cavalry. But the difference between being prepared and not being prepared was very big. So much so that before the cavalry of both sides officially came into contact, arrows rained down like raindrops. No less than 100 people in the vanguard of the Baiming cavalry were shot and fell from their horses. And this was just the beginning of the contest. When Ma Xiongfeng led the 1st Battalion to charge into the Baiming cavalry unit, and when Dingshan's 2nd Battalion and Tai Mu'er's 3rd Battalion stabbed into the Baiming army's formation like two sharp knives, Zhu Dehai's face finally showed a look of fear. At this moment he realized that the cavalry under his command had become a pot of porridge. They didn't know where to charge and what to do. The steel cavalry sabers and ordinary cavalry sabers began the first round of clashes, followed by the 2nd round, 3rd round and 4th round. After 4 rounds, the panicked and unprepared Baiming cavalry suffered great losses. About 1/7 of the cavalry was cut off from their horses. But what was even worse was that after 4 rounds of clashes, some of the cavalry sabers in the hands of the Baiming cavalry actually showed signs of breaking. The slightly better ones also had large gaps. If you want to attack first, you must first sharpen your weapon. Originally they were not prepared enough. Now that the enemy had taken the initiative, they were caught unprepared. Then their weapons were not as sharp and durable as the enemy's. Some of the Baiming cavalry, although still seated on their horses, had nothing in their hands that could be used. Some were broken sabers and some were even bare-handed. How were they going to fight the following battle? Retreat. Shocked by the strength of the 5-star army, shocked by the sharpness of the enemy's cavalry sabers, Zhu Dehai, who was protected by a dozen bodyguards, saw that his strength was not as good as the enemy's. He turned his horse around and madly galloped back. At this time, Zhu Dehai was very familiar with Sun Tzu's art of war. The last of the 36 stratagems was to run. If you can't win, run. This was the best example. At this time Zhu Dehai was completely dizzy. He had already forgotten that once he turned around he would be facing the glaring sunlight. But at this time he had completely forgotten all of this. There was only one voice in his mind and that was to run. As long as he could escape, he might have a chance to live. The situation was not good, so he turned around and ran without hesitation. Zhu Dahai still had a very decisive heart. But his luck was really too bad. After running against the sunlight for a few li, a large army suddenly appeared in front of him. Because of the light, he only saw the enemy swarming towards him when he was less than 2 li away. The dust that covered the sky and covered the sun was flying. It was the cavalry led by the 3rd Division's 3rd Regiment, the Spring Sun Division, and the Independent Regiment Tiger's Mane. There were close to 3,000 people. According to Yang Qindong's orders, they had set off 15 minutes later. As if they were afraid that the enemy would be wiped out from the beginning of the charge, the two cavalry forces were racing against each other, afraid that they would be one step slower than the enemy. Originally, after 15 minutes, the two reinforced regiments, the 1st and 2nd Divisions of the 3rd Division, Baiming's army would have been defeated. If they were lucky, they might be able to clean up the mess. But never would they have thought that before they even reached the battlefield, they would already see the enemy. Although there weren't many of them, only a few hundred cavalry, in the eyes of the Spring Sun and Tiger's Mane, they were already a piece of juicy meat. Independent Regiment, charge with me. Tiger's Mane laughed heartily. He kept urging his warhorse to charge towards Zhu Dahai's troops. Regiment Commander, what do we do? The 1st Battalion's commander Lu Qing urged his horse to Spring Sun's side. His face was filled with anxiety. What do we do? Of course we have to go. There is no such thing as superior and inferior on the battlefield, hee. Spring Sun laughed wildly. By the time he finished speaking, he had already charged out on his warhorse. Tiger's Mane was his superior. Even his division commander Wu Sheng respected him. But this was the battlefield. There was no such thing as modesty when killing the enemy. Seeing the regiment commander dashing out without any hesitation, battalion commander Lu Qing laughed out loud and followed after him. The soldiers of the 3rd Regiment also yelled and shouted as they charged forward with their sabers in hand. Chapter 663. Poor Zhu Dahai. He thought that his actions were decisive. He thought that he was like a gecko with a broken tail and that he could finally escape. But he never imagined that he would have to face two ferocious armies. When he discovered his opponents, his fate was already sealed. The cavalry from both sides collided in the blink of an eye. Just as the cavalry clashed with the cavalry, blood splattered everywhere. Sharp sabers flashing with silver light were constantly raised and chopped down. One by one, the Baiming cavalry was forced to block the attacks. Some of them couldn't even withstand one blow and were immediately chopped down from their horses. Some of them were quite good on horseback, but when faced with continuous chopping, how many times could they block? They could only raise their arms a few more times. In the end, they still couldn't avoid the fate of being chopped down from their horses. Zhu Dahai's horse-riding skills were considered passable. He was barely able to exchange blows with the two 5-star army cavalrymen. Under the powerful impact, he could already feel his arms swelling. Just as he was thinking that he wouldn't be able to withstand a few more collisions like this, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to lift his arm anymore. However, when their weapons collided for the 3rd time, a completely unexpected scene occurred. The saber in his hand actually broke into 2 pieces. How could this be? This scene caused Zhu Dahai's eyes to widen. The quality of the saber in his hand wasn't bad. How could it break after only 3 collisions? If he didn't even have a weapon, how could he fight? All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind. Then another cavalry from the 5-star army flew past them. Zhu Dahai reflexively raised his right arm to block the attack. But then an intense pain spread from his arm to his entire body. Then he stared in disbelief as his right arm was separated from his body. Fresh blood spurted out from his body and filled his eyes. His right arm was already gone. He didn't feel the pain because the saber in the hands of the 5-star army was too fast. It was so fast that he didn't even feel the pain before everything was over. And before he could cry out in shock, another cavalry from the 5-star army rode past him. This was a scene that he would never forget for the rest of his life. For the first time, he could clearly see his own back. That was the last thing he saw before his head flew high into the air. Then there was only darkness, an endless and boundless darkness. The hundreds of Baiming cavalry that escaped were quickly disintegrated under 2 charges from the 5-star army. About 2/3 of them died in battle and 1/3 was taken captive. At the same time, the Baiming cavalry under General Sun Hong was also targeted by the reinforced cavalry regiment. When Windchaser discovered that Lu Zhu's troops were chasing after Zhu Dahai's troops, he gave the task of dealing with the Baiming infantry to the 1st and 2nd regiments of the 3rd Division. He led the reinforced cavalry regiment to target the more powerful Sun Hong's troops. Using young Master Yang Qindong's words, 10,000 cavalry against 5,000 Baiming cavalry and 5,000 Baiming infantry. The battle hadn't even started yet, but the outcome had already been decided. Rather than calling it a battle, it was more accurate to call it a training exercise. Even if it was a training exercise, how to ignite everyone's fighting spirit, how to create an invincible heart through this battle, this was the true meaning of this battle. Since it was a training exercise, of course they had to choose the strongest enemy as their opponent. Looking at the battle horses, Baiming's 2,000 cavalry was barely enough to be seen. Everyone in the reinforced cavalry regiment, put on your glasses and follow this regiment commander. After adjusting the direction of the battle horses, Windchaser released a loud shout, taking the lead and bringing the 1st and 2nd regiments of the reinforced cavalry regiment to charge towards the right side of the battlefield. People shouted, horses neighed, banners covering the skies, bright 5-starred banners fluttering in the wind everywhere. The bugle call that replaced the sounds of drums sounded again and again, loud and clear, pouring into the ears of everyone on the battlefield. Sun Hong, who was still backing up, had a downcast expression on his face. He ignored the direction of the sunlight, placing him in a completely passive state from the very start of the battle. He knew that he was going to suffer greatly today. However, he still didn't believe that he would lose, just that his losses would be a bit more serious. It was because he was leading 2,000 cavalry from the Jianzhou Guard, the elites of the northern soldiers, possessing second-rate fighting strength. Unless they were facing the Mongol cavalry and Walla cavalry who had lived on horses since childhood, no enemy would make him feel fear. Release the arrows, draw the blades, charge. Cut the enemy into several pieces. Let them know what kind of fate awaits those who make our Jianzhou Guard cavalry their enemies. A roar sounded. Sun Hong held a large blade that was over a zhang in length. After releasing a loud shout, under the protection of a group of personal guards, he increased the speed of his horse, charging towards the reinforced cavalry regiment led by Windchaser. The 1st Battalion is at the front, the 2nd Battalion is in the middle, and the 3rd Battalion is at the back. Windchaser similarly didn't show any weakness. Brandishing the cavalry blade that flickered with cold radiance after releasing a loud shout, he also took the lead and launched a fierce charge. The two forces of cavalry with similar strength and numbers finally began to clash an hour after the battle began. When enemies met on a narrow path, the courageous would emerge victorious. A battle of cavalry where every blade drew blood began. Charge, charge. The commanders of both sides separately gave the final military orders. A total of 4,000 warhorses clashed together by the Liao River, becoming a great battle. In just the first clash, there were already countless streaks of bright red blood that splashed in all directions. At any moment, there would be cavalry soldiers that fell off their horses, or there would be broken limbs that flew into the air. There were Baiming cavalry, Nuzan cavalry, Mongol cavalry, and Han cavalry that fell off their horses. At this moment, the cavalry all displayed their abilities. At this moment, no one would show you the slightest bit of leniency because of your background or race. At this moment, if you didn't kill others, then you would be killed by others. No one was an exception. Windchaser raised his cavalry blade, already continuously hacking down more than 10 people. At least 4 Baiming cavalry were chopped off their horses by him. At the same time, 3 enemies were injured by him. His body also suffered 2 cuts. Fortunately, he had the protection of the bulletproof vest, so these 2 cuts didn't truly injure him. Jianzhou Guard cavalry is unordinary after all. After another charge, Windchaser, who had rushed to the back of Baiming cavalry, reined in his horse. He sighed in his heart, and at the same time his fighting spirit was infinitely aroused. You guys are very strong, right? It's good. The stronger the opponent, the more you can train yourself. He believed that after this battle, although there would be some losses in the reinforcement regiment, their combat strength would definitely increase by a lot. Wasn't this what the 6th young master and himself wanted? Not far away, Commander Wu Sheng and Political Commissar Chen Bo, who had already divided the Baiming infantry into several groups, also noticed the battle on the right side of the battlefield. They saw that the reinforcement regiment already had more than 100 people killed or injured, but they didn't have any intention of joining in. If an army wanted to grow, the process must be bloody. Only after experiencing this could they become a truly strong army. During this process, others couldn't help much. Of course, Wu Xing and Uncle Chen were also watching this place. As long as they noticed that the reinforcement regiment was not as strong as the enemy, they would immediately intervene. In short, they would never allow their side to be defeated in front of them. However, the reality was that this kind of thought was destined not to appear. After this clash, the two sides had already swapped positions. Hundreds of cavalry from both sides had fallen, as well as many lonely war horses. However, this didn't mean that the battle was over. It was just the beginning. After the two sides swapped positions, the dazzling sunlight once again shone on the faces of the Baiming cavalry. Sun Hong's expression was frighteningly dark. Just now he had also displayed his might and killed at least 3 5-star army cavalry. At the same time, he also noticed that the enemy had something that could protect their eyes. He didn't know what it was called, but he knew that with that thing, they didn't seem to be afraid of the dazzling sunlight. The enemy had it, but he didn't. Now that he had to face the sunlight and attack, the disadvantage would uncontrollably appear. The cavalry of the Jianzhou Guard seemed to be in danger. While Sun Hong was hesitating, the cavalry of the 5-star army cavalry on the opposite side once again charged over. It was still the 1st Battalion at the front, followed by the 2nd Battalion and the 3rd Battalion at the back. Ma Xianxia, the commander of the 1st Battalion, shouted loudly. Combined with the blood of the enemy that flew to his face when he killed the enemy just now, it made him look very scary at this moment. There was a feeling of a killing god that walked out of hell. Ma Xianxia held the saber in his right hand and the reins in his left hand. He attached his body to the horse as much as possible to protect the streamline of his body and reduce the wind resistance. This allowed him to charge forward at a faster speed. This speed could multiply the power in his hands. At this time, once the saber was slashed out, even a small tree stump could be easily cut down. This was the power of the combination of speed and sharpness of the saber. The saber that was given to them this time, although it wasn't as long as the spear and saber because it was short, it was more powerful and nimble. In addition, it had a very satisfying sharpness. The number of enemy cavalry that died in Ma Xianxia's hands had already exceeded 5 people, which made him very satisfied. He also seemed to be born for the battlefield. After killing several people, not only did he not feel the slightest bit of fatigue, but he was also very excited. This excitement naturally turned into boundless killing intent. When he waved the saber again, his face was only left with a flush of excitement. The more he fought, the braver he became. This was the description of soldiers like Ma Xianxia. Following Ma Xianxia's loud shout, the soldiers of the 1st Battalion were also inspired and infected. They all shouted and rushed forward together with the battalion commander. From afar, he was like a sharp arrow that directly pierced into the ranks of the Baiming cavalry. Chapter 664. What was even worse was that behind this arrow, the 2nd Battalion's Ding Shan's troops and the 3rd Battalion's Teimu's troops also formed arrows and flew straight over with an unstoppable momentum. In comparison, the Northern Ming cavalry was naturally much weaker in terms of aura. In the first clash, they relied on their self-confidence, relying on the momentum that the world would avoid whenever they appeared. However, when they truly clashed, they discovered that the 5-star army was much stronger than they had imagined. Their unstoppable momentum, their sharp sabers, and their merciless ruthlessness actually caused them to suffer a small loss in the first clash. Looking at the center of the battlefield, they accounted for 2/3 of the cavalry that were killed. They were like little flowers in a greenhouse, always thinking that they were the most beautiful in the world. However, when they entered the primeval forest, they were lucky enough to see all kinds of beautiful flowers blooming. When they saw flowers that were far more beautiful than them, they naturally had the thought of viewing the sky from the bottom of a well. The clash with the 5-star army also taught the Baiming cavalry a deep lesson. It let them know that apart from the Mongol Empire and the Walla Empire, they were not the strongest cavalry in the world. Once such a thought appeared, it could not be suppressed. If they lost in terms of temperament, their morale would naturally be much weaker. Taking advantage of this time, the five-star army once again clashed. Looking at the vast number of enemies charging at them, most of the Baiming cavalry could not even open their eyes completely. In addition to the lack of morale, the morale of the army began to fall into chaos. Don't panic, don't be afraid. We will always be the strongest. Everyone follow me and attack. Sun Hong sensed the change in the mood of the cavalryman beside him. After he knew that something was wrong, he shouted loudly. Then, without giving the other cavalrymen time to react, he led a dozen of his personal guards and was the first to gallop out. No matter what, he had led troops for many years and had experience. The more it was like this, the more Sun Hong knew that he could not hesitate. He could not give the soldiers any more time to think. Otherwise, once the morale of the army crumbled, there would be no way to continue fighting this battle. Sun Hong took the lead and charged out. With him leading the charge, many of the Baiming cavalry who were still hesitating followed him. However, they were still one step too late and allowed Sun Hong to become the vanguard. Moreover, there were only a dozen of them in the vanguard. Logically speaking, when cavalry clashed, the general of each side should be protected. After all, if the general was there, the morale of the army would be there. If the general died, the morale would be gone. However, at this time he did not care about that. He didn't dare to stop and wait for the cavalrymen behind him to converge. Who knew if the cavalrymen behind him would also stop if he stopped? Such a move was no different from courting death in a situation where the cavalrymen were charging at him. Sun Hong, who had no choice but to brace himself and charge forward, did his best to avoid the main force of the five-star army cavalry. He wanted to take a roundabout route and charge past the enemy cavalry. As long as he did not clash head-on with the enemy cavalry, there shouldn't be any danger. Therefore, what happened next was a puzzling scene. With Sun Hong as the vanguard, the dozen or so Baiming cavalry didn't meet the imposing main force of the five-star army cavalry. Instead, they dodged and charged to the side of the battlefield. This was a clear display of weakness to the enemy. It was even a cowardly action. It was something that the cavalry code of conduct did not allow to happen. It was because once one side did this, they would lose the morale of the army before the battle even began. If that happened, then it would be impossible for them to win this battle. As the commander of the Jian Province Guards, how could a dignified third-grade military general not know this principle? However, did he have any other choice? He was already the vanguard, so he didn't have any more cavalry to protect him. If he continued to clash head-on with the five-star army cavalry, what difference would that be from courting death? The only thing Sun Hong, who didn't want to die, could do was avoid the enemy's main force. Even though doing this would make others look down on him, choosing the lesser of two evils, for the sake of his own small life, he could only act like a coward. Sun Hong suddenly rushed to the side of the battlefield, indeed allowing him to avoid the greatest risk. However, what he forgot was that there were still more than 1,000 Baiming cavalry behind him. On the battlefield, following the general's banner, following the general's footsteps would never be wrong. Oftentimes, this was the most appropriate state to adopt under chaos. That was why when Sun Hong suddenly changed directions, the Baiming cavalry behind him also followed suit. They didn't know that Sun Hong feared death and battle. Under the blinding sunlight, they already couldn't see the movements of the distant five-star army. Those who didn't know any better only thought that this was one of the general's strategies, while all they had to do was follow the general's footsteps. That was why when Baiming cavalry suddenly collectively moved to the side, it was the same as completely exposing one side of their bodies to the five-star army's cavalry. 1st Battalion Commander Ma Xianxia, who had originally already prepared himself for a life-and-death battle, when he saw that the enemy cavalry actually didn't face them head-on, instead exposing one side of their bodies to him, how could he let go of such a good opportunity? Raising his arm high, he brought the reinforced 1st Battalion's 6 companies of close to 600 cavalry to slaughter their way over from the side, delivering a heavy blow to the completely unprepared Baiming cavalry who didn't even have time to turn their horses around. With a raise of his hand and a fall of his blade, over 100 Baiming cavalry were cut down from their horses, also throwing the enemy's formation into chaos. They just couldn't understand how this battle was fought. How did they end up exposing their flanks to the five-star army's cavalry? Was this really the path General Sun Hong pointed out? No matter what they thought in their hearts, it was a fact that they had suffered heavy losses. Following that, 2nd Battalion Ding Shan's troops and 3rd Battalion Taimur's troops arrived one after another. Again and again they faced the side, causing more and more Baiming cavalry to be cut down from their horses. Countless cries of agony resounded throughout the battlefield. In the end, the war horses still crossed each other. After passing through 3 waves of Baiming cavalry, there were only about 500 cavalry that managed to charge through. On the other hand, the reinforced cavalry only lost a few soldiers in the second wave of charge. Sun Hong had used his wits to avoid the greatest risk. He survived, but because he didn't set a good example, the cavalry under his command suffered heavy losses. When he finally reined in his horse and turned around to look, he saw that there were only 500 cavalry left. His face immediately darkened and then he panicked, lost, scared and terrified. He was the commander, a dignified 3rd-rank Baiming military officer. There was still a great future waiting for him. He definitely couldn't throw away his life here at this time. Many thoughts ran through his mind at this moment. As a result, after making a wrong decision, he made a second wrong decision, which was to run. He turned around and reined in his horse, galloping into the sunlight. Sun Hong already didn't have the courage to carry out a 3rd cavalry charge. He didn't have confidence in himself, nor did he have confidence in the cavalry under his command. Right now, what he had to do was immediately hurry back to the Jianzhou Guard, and then tell his superior about the 5-star army's terror. Even if he had to be punished for this, he would accept it. In short, his life could be preserved, and then there would be a day when he could rise again. The 500 Baiming cavalry who had charged out of the 5-star army's formation with great difficulty saw their own brothers hacked to the ground with their own eyes. While they blamed their main general for his poor command, they also wanted to charge back and get revenge for their comrades. However, they never would have thought that their main general Sun Hong would run away just like that, bringing more than 10 personal soldiers with him. Retreat. Among the 500 cavalry there were still 3 centurions. After exchanging a single look, they similarly made the decision to retreat. Even though after doing this, even if they returned they would still be punished, but even Commander Sun ran, so were they still going to stay here and serve as live targets for the enemy? The 3 centurions made the same decision. The 500 cavalry turned around and fled, chasing after Sun Hong's figure. Cowards without balls. After a short rest, when Ma Xianxia launched his 3rd charge, what he saw was precisely the scene of Baiming cavalry fleeing. After cursing loudly from his horse, he immediately chased after them with the high morale 1st Battalion. Behind him, the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Battalion, and the 2 companies directly under the regiment commander Windseeker also followed one after another. Right now they had already won this battle. The only difference was how much of a victory they could expand to. If they could capture or kill the enemy's main general, then that would be perfect. However, after all, the enemy had fled a step first, so if they wanted to capture him, it wouldn't be easy. No matter how hard it would be, they should always try. Just like this, on the right side of the battlefield, Baiming cavalry was crazily running at the front. Behind them was a group of 5-star army cavalry following behind. Both sides were getting further and further away from the Liao River. Facing the dazzling sunlight, Sun Hong led a dozen personal guards to run at the front. From time to time he would turn around to take a look, his face revealing a fortunate expression. Even though this time he acted as a coward, but this kind of method of immediately retreating when he couldn't defeat the enemy still caught the enemy off guard. It seemed like his little life was saved. Sighing in his heart, Sun Hong continuously used the horsewhip to whip his warhorse, wanting to quickly leave the battlefield and ensure his safety. As time passed, the dazzling sunlight wasn't as strong as before. Sun Hong could finally see everything in front of him clearly. Because of this, his eyes widened more and more, because he actually saw a cavalry appear in front of him. In his impression, he definitely didn't send any reinforcements to support him. Then where did this cavalry come from? Could it be the reinforcements sent by Sacha River Guards and Tai Ningwei? Chapter 665. Yes, that must be the case. The thought flashed through his mind and Sun Hong's face brightened up. Reinforcements had finally arrived. Although both of them were 1,000-man guards and the total number of cavalrymen was only around 600, it was still not a problem to use them well. That way it would be easier for him to escape. The fearful expression on Sun Hong's face was replaced by a hearty laugh. He led the 500 riders to meet the incoming cavalry head-on. The war horses of both sides were galloping forward, and the distance between the two sides was getting closer and closer. When they were only 2 miles away, they could finally see the lineup of the other side. Their faces were still unclear, but from their clothes, they could already distinguish the identity of the other side. Fuck. Sun Hong couldn't help but curse when he saw the enemy's uniform, especially when he saw the 5-star flag fluttering in the wind. Enemy soldiers? Why are there enemy soldiers here? Could it be that the 5-star army predicted that I would be defeated and escape? Of course, it was expected that I would be defeated. I really didn't expect that I would be defeated. Everything was just a coincidence. The enemy was the 3RD Division's 3rd Regiment Spring Sun and Tiger's Main's Independent Cavalry Division's 4 battalions. Not long after they charged out, they were lucky enough to encounter the defeated Zhu Dahai's troops. Naturally, they surrounded them and wasted some time there. Sun Hong thought that after such a long time, the battle would be over and they wouldn't need to do anything else. However, the heavens were really good to them. They encountered another Baiming army. After seeing that it was the Baiming cavalry, Tiger's Mane and Spring Sun didn't care about which division they were from. They were afraid that the enemy would steal their credit and charged forward with their swords drawn. The 2,000 cavalrymen were like cats that saw mice. They were afraid that if they were late they wouldn't have the chance to kill the enemy. It was actually the 5-star army. Sun Hong's eyes widened and his body trembled. How could there still be a 5-star army here? Since they were so powerful, why didn't they just charge it the first time? If that was the case, wouldn't they be defeated in a single charge? How would Sun Hong know that the number of people in the 5-star army reported by the scout didn't include the people guarding the supplies? Those people were the independent soldiers. They were usually in charge of logistics, but they were elite soldiers on the battlefield during wartime. The reason why they didn't use their advantage in numbers was because they wanted to train the newly formed cavalry and strengthen the 1st and 2nd Regiment. If they came at him with a crushing force, then what was the point of training? Sun Hong, whose heart was trembling, seemed to be frozen in place. Then a soldier beside him shouted, "General, run quickly. They are coming." There were already close to 2,000 soldiers chasing after them, and another 2,000 were coming from the opposite side. How were they going to fight this battle? If they didn't run, what were they waiting for? Run? Where do you think you're going? Sun Hong's entire body seemed to have lost its spirit. The distance between them was too close, less than 2 li. A single charge would be enough to reach the front of the formation. There were also soldiers chasing behind them, so there was no way to run. Sun Hong had completely lost his confidence. After lamenting, he turned around and looked at the 500 soldiers behind him. He shook his head and said, "You guys should surrender. Perhaps you will still have a way out. Remember, don't resist. That will only be a meaningless sacrifice." Sun Hong persuaded his subordinates to surrender because he didn't want them to die like this. This was the only thing he could do as a general. Then he pulled out the sword on his body and a bitter smile appeared on his face. Then he slashed his neck. His movements were too fast. Before anyone could figure out what was going on, Sun Hong had already fallen from his horse. His eyes were wide open as if he was expressing the unwillingness in his heart. But in the end he still killed himself. The soldiers under him could surrender, but as the general he absolutely couldn't do so. He still had his family and family behind him. If he really surrendered to the 5-star army once the news spread, only his family would be implicated. So he only had one choice: death. Sun Hong died. Without their general, the 500 Baiming cavalry chose to surrender when they were surrounded by the 5-star army. Among them there were some hot-blooded men who wanted to die for a righteous cause. But before they could pull out their swords and prepare to fight, they were stopped by their fellow soldiers. You may not be afraid of death, but some people were. If your individual resistance angered the 5-star army and they were all killed, then wouldn't everyone be buried with you? In the end, the 500 Baiming cavalry all surrendered. Normally, with 500 surrendered soldiers, everyone should be happy. But no matter how one looked at it, Tiger's Mane, Windchaser and Spring Sun, they didn't have any smiles on their faces. It was clear that they were still depressed because they couldn't kill to their heart's content. When Sun Hong committed suicide, the Baiming camp by the Liao River gradually quieted down. The general of this army, Tang Longtian, was captured, and the 30,000 guards commander Wang Tong was killed on the battlefield. With the death or capture of their generals, the Baiming army also lost their will to fight. When they saw a large number of 5-star army cavalry surround them, they all threw down the weapons in their hands and chose to surrender. Right now it was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The summer days were already very long, but at this time the sky was still very bright. To be able to end the battle so quickly, it was far beyond everyone's expectations. This was 10,000 Ming army, and it was 10,000 Ming army that was prepared. But when faced with 10,000 5-star army cavalry, they only fought for a few hours before being wiped out. From this point, it was enough to prove the strength and terror of cavalry. It also proved how much of an advantage cavalry had when fighting infantry. Clean up the battlefield, check the military supplies, calculate the results, and send someone to inform the 6th young master. Victory at Liao River. 30 li behind the 5-star army's main camp. Battalion Commander Su Yunxing's reconnaissance unit and the 3rd Division's Battalion Commander Guanzhong were facing off against the Sacha River Guards and Taining Guards 600 Baiming Cavalry. 1,000 Guards Commander Yi La and Taining Guards Vice 1,000 Guards Commander Lu Dai each led 300 Baiming Cavalry on a plain. The 2,000 Guards' faces didn't change much at this moment. They knew that this moment would come sooner or later. Since they had been following behind the 5-star army, they were already prepared for battle. Sir Yi, the enemy cavalry seems to be a bit more than us. Looking seriously at the 5-star army cavalry that appeared 500 meters away, Lu Dai estimated in his heart and asked 1,000 Guards Commander Yi La, "So what if they have more people? It's just 100 or 200 more cavalry. We brought the world's most elite Nuzan cavalry, what is there to be afraid of?" Yi La's face was full of pride. For Nuzan to be able to become the Baiming Guard's 1,000 guards, he was destined to put in more effort than others. He was also destined to have stronger strength than normal Han army generals. In fact, Yi La did rely on his own bravery to obtain his current position. While the other Qin who mostly relied on their ancestors to obtain their high positions, he had always been working hard at the lowest level. After many bloody battles he finally obtained his position. Not only that, as the 1,000 Guards Commander of Nuzan, he also used his authority to change his 300 cavalry to Nuzan cavalry. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that the army he led had a glorious battle record of defeating 2,000 bandits. At this moment they were only facing 800 5-star army cavalry, so what was there to be afraid of? More importantly, he was now wrapped in battle armor. From afar his entire body was pitch black and there were no flaws. This was also where his confidence came from when he rushed into the battlefield. Perhaps because Yi La was too confident, or perhaps because he was infected by his confidence, Lu Dai, who was originally a bit worried, calmed down a lot. I have long heard that Sir Yi is very brave. To be able to join hands with Sir today is truly a pleasure. Since that's the case, allow me to join hands with Sir. Sir, please hold the formation. I will go test the enemy's strength. Lu Dai wanted to take the initiative to attack. In fact, half of the 300 cavalry he brought were Nuzan cavalry. This was where his confidence came from. Good, this 1,000 guard will watch General Lu display his might. However, please remember, if there is something difficult to deal with, immediately retreat. This general will come to your rescue. Yi La was very satisfied that Lu Dai wanted to take the initiative to test the enemy's strength. This was the Nuzan's style. No matter how strong the enemy was, they would not be afraid and would dare to draw their swords. With Yi La holding the formation, Lu Dai was much more confident. He pulled out his saber and shouted to the 300 cavalry behind him, "Brave warriors, our chance to show off has come. Follow this general and charge." Kill. The 300 cavalry formed by Nuzan and Han people roared in unison. Then they waved their whips and dashed toward the 5-star army. In the 5-star army, seeing the Baiming cavalry charging, the battalion commander of the 3rd Division, Guanzhong, laughed loudly. Then he looked at the calm Su Yunxing and said, "Battalion Commander Su, you are the treasures in the eyes of the 6th young master. For a charge like this, it is better for us, the direct division, to do it." Su Yunxing really wanted to be the vanguard, but when he considered Guanzhong's words, that the scouts were made up of the most elite soldiers, it was indeed a waste of talent to use them in front of a cavalry formation that could easily be damaged. Su Yunxing nodded and said, "All right, please be careful, Battalion Commander Guan." Don't worry, Battalion Commander Su. The person who can kill me hasn't been born yet. With a heroic laugh, Guanzhong pulled out his shining saber and waved it forward. Direct division, follow me and kill. Chapter 666. Kill. Another deafening roar rang out as the 450 cavalrymen of the 5th Star Corps followed behind Battalion Commander Guanzhong. They charged towards the 300 northern Ming cavalrymen that were swarming over. A cavalry charge was one of the most ancient and bloody ways of fighting. In the process of such a clash, there was not much skill involved. What was needed was the morale of both sides, the strength of both sides and the strength of both sides. This was often a way of harming the enemy by 1,000 but also harming 800. But even if they knew this, the cavalry charge was still the favorite of many cavalrymen. This was because only this kind of battle could show the glory of the cavalry. This was what true men and warriors should do. The cavalry from both sides were like two torrents as they clashed against each other on the vast plains. Men shouted, horses neighed, weapons clashed, and shouts rose and fell one after another. In just a single clash, dozens of cavalry from both sides had fallen off their horses. At least a dozen warhorses were heavily injured by the powerful inertia and fell to the ground. The sounds of the warhorses neighing rang in the ears of every cavalry. In this clash, the division's direct subordinate battalions only had a slight advantage in terms of numbers. The casualty ratio on the battlefield was 7-13. They couldn't even kill twice as many people. This made Guanzhong's face turn ugly. Get ready, charge. Guanzhong once again swung his saber and launched a second attack. Compared to Guanzhong, Lu Dai's face was even uglier. Half of the 300 cavalrymen he brought were Nuzan elite cavalrymen. Not only did they not gain any advantage in this clash, they even suffered a loss. This was something that he couldn't accept. Fortunately, the 13 cavalrymen that died were all elite cavalrymen. There wasn't a single Nuzan cavalryman. Suppressing the anger in his heart, Lu Dai raised his head and looked at the 5-star army cavalrymen charging over. He also waved his saber and shouted, "Kill!" Another clash of cavalrymen. This time both sides were clearly enraged and the casualty ratio increased. More than 30 cavalrymen died, including 3 Nuzan cavalrymen. The direct subordinate battalion lost 20 cavalrymen and a few were injured. Charge! Guanzhong stopped his horse, turned around and continued to wave his saber. Another charge came from Guanzhong's mouth. Lu Dai also roared as he led his cavalrymen forward. Su Yunxing, who was sitting on the sidelines, stared at all of this as he quickly assessed the situation. As the commander of the reconnaissance battalion, he had a much better grasp of the situation on the battlefield than Yang Chendong. After all, not every piece of information had to be reported. Some insignificant matters would often be stopped when they were reported to him. This also allowed Su Yunxing to gain a better understanding of the 600 cavalrymen on the other side. Out of the 600 cavalrymen, 3/4 of them were Nuzan cavalrymen. There was also information that they were made up of the elite cavalrymen. Nuzan had spent a lot of effort to train them in order to increase their strength and influence. Su Yunxing had seen the Nuzan cavalry before, just like the group of people represented by Hu Lu in Narcissus Town. Their strength was not bad, but it was only not bad. Compared to Lung Feng, they were still much weaker. However, the Nuzan cavalry in front of them seemed to be particularly powerful. It could be seen from the battle between them and the Nuzan cavalry. Moreover, the Nuzan cavalry didn't have the advantage in numbers. If the Nuzan cavalry had more troops than them, wouldn't the situation of the battlefield be changed? Just as Su Yunxing was seriously observing the situation, the first company commander, Yenda, came over. "Commander, are you interested in talent?" To be able to enter the reconnaissance battalion, not to mention their skills, just their brains alone needed to be very flexible. They needed to constantly change according to the changes on the battlefield. Just by looking at Su Yunxing's changing gaze, Yenda could roughly guess what was going on. It had to be said that this person's eyesight was very good. The first company commander, Yenda, could be said to be Su Yunxing's direct subordinate. When Su Yunxing was not around, he would be in charge of the reconnaissance battalion. This also proved his ability. Now that he stood up and asked, Su Yunxing nodded. The 6th young master once said that once we find a good seedling, we should recruit them. After all, our cavalrymen are still too weak. So, you know what I mean. Of course, Yenda understood. He even knew that killing a person was not as good as finding a more suitable talent. It would also add more points in the sixth young master's heart. Yes, Commander is right. According to the intelligence, the Nuzan is the leader of the cavalrymen. Furthermore, they are the elites among them. Naturally, their strength is not bad. If Commander needs it, I am willing to take the first company to test them. Don't worry, I know my limits. Before you make the final decision, I will try my best not to hurt them. Yenda wanted to test himself. This was also to gauge the other party's strength. There was a saying that went, "What do you think is false, but seeing is believing." Here you go. Be careful. Alright, if necessary you can use a gun. Use tranquilizer bullets. Zhou Xian thought for a while and instructed. The tranquilizer bullets he spoke of were naturally the ones in the warehouse. After the finished product was sent to the arsenal in Crimson City, after a lot of effort the finished product was finally produced. However, due to the scarcity of the materials, not all armies were equipped with them. Currently only a few special units were using them. Sometimes the scouts would be equipped with some when they wanted to catch tongues alive. However, there were not many of them. Since Zhou Xian said that tranquilizer bullets could be used at critical times, just this point alone was enough to show how much he valued these hundreds of Nuzan cavalrymen. Okay, you can use them. Yenda smiled confidently and left on his horse. He called for 100 brothers of the first company to charge into the battlefield with him. Like Zhou Xian, Yella also looked at the battlefield with furrowed brows. He was very clear about the standard of Lu Dai's 300 cavalrymen. Although their combat strength was not as good as his, they barely had half of his combat strength. However, even with half of their combat strength, they still did not gain any advantage. Instead, they suffered quite a bit. This made him re-evaluate the strength of the 5-star army. It was at this time that he saw the 100 cavalrymen led by Yenda enter the battlefield. Humph. Yella snorted coldly. They want to interfere in the battlefield in front of me. Men, send 100 cavalrymen to test their strength. Zhou Xian did not move. Yella also did not move. Both sides reserved a certain amount of combat strength in preparation for the final battle. Yenda led the soldiers of the first company onto the battlefield. However, they did not intend to help Commander Guanzhong deal with Lu Dai. Instead, they moved towards Yella's troops. When he noticed that the enemy had also sent out 100 cavalrymen, Commander Yenda laughed loudly. Brothers, the enemy has also made a move. Looks like we can have some fun. Come, the commander said, to try not to kill as much as possible. Let's see who can capture more tongues, living and useful enemies. The scouts of the first company immediately became excited. To be able to become a scout, there was no need to mention their skills and horsemanship. Unless they were surrounded by enemies several times their size. Otherwise, even if they could not defeat the enemy, they could still retreat unscathed. And now that it was only one-on-one, there was even less of a difficulty. Many of the soldiers even began to put away their cavalry swords and rubbed their fists. Since they wanted to capture the enemy alive, the sharp cavalry swords naturally had to be put away. They were all confident in their horsemanship. They believed that they could get close to the enemy without being injured and then capture the enemy with a single hand. Different from the 3 divisions who had just expanded their forces, the scouts still chose the seedlings of the cold front even though they were expanding from the company to the battalion. In other words, the 100 people who came out to fight this time were all cold front soldiers, and they were all experienced cold front soldiers. Not only were they very good at teamwork, but they were also very good at martial arts. Few people could be their match. And when these 100 cold front soldiers entered the battlefield, it was only a nightmare for the enemy. The moment they saw the Nuzan cavalrymen charging towards them, these 100 people began to perform all kinds of horse tricks. Some hit their bodies on the side of the war horse, some completely climbed on the horse and became one with it. Some only had one foot on the stirrups and were ready to pounce at any time. In short, the 100 cavalrymen performed all kinds of difficult horse tricks. The Nuzan cavalrymen were indeed quite capable. Facing the actions of the first company of scouts, many of them also began to play tricks. They also performed all kinds of difficult tricks on their horses and then quickly closed in on the enemy. Both sides seemed to have a tacit understanding, and that was to try their best not to use their cavalry swords. They wanted to see whose horsemanship was better and whose horse skills were better. They wanted to see who could capture who in the end. This kind of battle could only be done by those who were extremely confident. Just from this point alone, these 100 Nuzan cavalrymen could be considered elites. The enemy had sent out all their elites and were full of confidence in their own martial arts. A great battle that was similar to catching a thief on horseback was about to begin. In the distance, the horse trap, a way to catch wild horses and later used to trap the enemy on the horse, attacks. When they got close, it simply became a fight where you grab and I dodge and I grab and you dodge. All of this happened in the instant when the two horses crossed paths. Speaking of lassoing attacks, it was clear that the Nuzan cavalry was better at it. Their lassoing was fast and accurate, and a few scouts were caught because they could not dodge in time or were not used to such an attack. This made Zhou Xian frown as he watched all of this happen. The good thing was that when it came to close combat and capturing people, the scouts were better. They were also used to capturing enemies at close range. Furthermore, to be a member of Cold Vanguard, which one of them wasn't strong and agile. This allowed them to capture more than 10 Jurchen cavalry in a very short period of time, turning the tide of the battle around. Chapter 667. Seeing more than 10 of his men being captured alive, Yela's expression turned ugly. He finally started to take the cavalry of the 5-star army seriously. He originally thought that in terms of horsemanship, the Nuzan cavalry would be the best. Even the Mongol cavalry would be inferior to them. But now it seemed that he was too arrogant. Attack together. Draw your swords. Seeing that the 5-star army was very strong, the situation would get worse if they continued to fight. Yela did not want to wait any longer. He did not know if Commander Sun Hong and the rest had already started fighting with the 5-star army. What he needed to do now was to meet up with the main force of the army. Yi La unsheathed his saber, and the 200 female cavalrymen beside him did the same. The 200 of them hollered and pressed their legs against the horse's abdomen, charging forward while yelling, "Follow me and stop them." Zhou Xian, who had been staring at Yela for a long time, had a "I knew you would do this" expression on his face. He took the lead and took out the 95 style from his back. Then he mounted his horse and charged into the battlefield. Firing immediately was the new requirement that Yang Chendong gave to the Cold Vanguard soldiers. Since the next step was to fight on horseback, how to steadily fire and hit the target at high speed became the main training direction for the Cold Vanguard soldiers. Some of the requirements sounded easy, but they were quite difficult to fulfill. For example, firing immediately was something that only a few people in the reconnaissance battalion could do. They were able to hit the target while on a moving horse. Coincidentally, Zhou Xian, as the battalion commander, was a soldier with this level of skill. As the warhorse moved forward, Zhou Xian held his gun and slowed his breathing. After he got used to the bumpy ride of the warhorse, his right index finger moved slightly. Then a bullet was fired from the gun barrel. The bullet flew straight towards Yi Ladeo, who was waving his saber as he charged forward. He did not hurt anyone because Zhou Xian thought highly of Yela's ability. To be able to train cavalry that could compete with the scouts, this kind of person was definitely a talent. This was also what the 6th young master needed. Bah! After a very unexpected gunshot, Yi La, who was running on his horse, felt his right arm sink. When he looked up instinctively, his eyes were filled with horror. He didn't know when, but there was a big gap on the sword in his hand and the blade was about to break. Who? Zhou Xian, who fired this shot, was also secretly thankful for his luck. After a period of training, after wasting a lot of bullets, he could now hit a target on a moving horse. However, for an object as thin as a blade, the probability of hitting it was still very low. 1 out of 5 shots was already the limit. For this shot to hit, there was more or less an element of luck involved. Zhou Xian secretly thought that he was lucky, but in Yi La's eyes, it really shocked him. Since the other party was able to hit his saber with a gun, wouldn't it be easier for him to kill him? How could the 5-star army's marksmanship be so good? Where did they come from? After becoming a Chiliarch of Baiming, Yi La more or less had a certain understanding of guns. However, from what he knew, Baiming's guns were extremely low in terms of stability and accuracy. Only the legendary mercenaries of the Duke of Loyalty's mercenaries were truly powerful, and they could fight against 10 or even 100 enemies. Could it be that the other party was using the world's most advanced guns? The thought only flashed through his mind for a moment. Yi La, who had already started his charge, didn't have time to think too much. Although he was indeed frightened, what if the other party was just coincidentally stunned? Moreover, he didn't think that the other party would intentionally hold back when they had the ability to kill him. They didn't have any relationship, so why would they do that? Quick, be careful. They have guns in their hands. We can only gain an advantage if we get close to them. Charge with me. After a short moment of hesitation, Yi La's shout rang out again. At this moment there was only one thought in his mind, and that was to charge in front of the other party, cut them down from their horses and then snatch the guns in their hands. That way he would be able to gain a great merit. The Nuzan cavalry could be said to be built by Yi La himself. He had invested all of his wealth and energy into it. The other people could name these 300 cavalry, and they treated each other like brothers. When he gave the order, they naturally rushed forward and surrounded Yang Qindong's troops from dozens of directions. They were either holding horse ropes in their hands or making a flying action, as if they wanted to capture the 5-star army alive. Interesting. Su Yunxing, who had fired a shot, saw that the other party had the same idea as him. They actually wanted to capture him alive. He couldn't help but smile, and his heart was filled with joy. Obviously, the other party had also taken a fancy to his extraordinary skills and even his weapon. They wanted to take it for their own use. Since both of them had such thoughts, then let's see whose methods were more brilliant. Come on, prepare the tranquilizer bullets. Don't be afraid of wasting them. As long as we can capture these people alive, I will report back the amount of bullets used. The more he saw the performance of the Nuzan cavalry, the more Su Yunxing was certain of the strength of these people. They were definitely first-class elite soldiers, especially their horse skills. It was obvious that compared to them, they were even stronger than the Windchaser cavalry regiment. If these people could be used for their own purposes, the mercenary cavalry's strength was very likely to increase by half a level or even more. The 6th young master had once said that talent was always the most important thing. Based on this sentence, they had only used up some tranquilizer bullets. No matter how they looked at it, they had profited greatly. The scouts were still having a headache from the other party's superb performance on the horse. They originally thought that their horse strength was very strong, but when they really compared, they realized that they still had too many shortcomings. When facing such a strong opponent, they couldn't help but feel a little lacking in confidence. Now that the camp commander had given the order to use the tranquilizer guns, they didn't have to worry about killing these elites. At that moment, everyone didn't hold back anymore. One by one, they took out their precious tranquilizer bullets and loaded them into their guns. They skillfully aimed, adjusted their breathing, and fired steadily. This series of actions was done naturally and smoothly. Bang bang bang. Bang bang bang. Gunshots rang out continuously. Without any misgivings, bullets flew out of the barrels and into the bodies and horses of the Nuzan cavalrymen who were trying to get close, and in reality were indeed very close to them. Originally, everyone still appreciated each other and wanted to control each other for their own use. This was the reason why they didn't start a fight as soon as they saw each other. But now suddenly the 5-star army started firing. Seeing their trusted subordinates trembling a few times after being shot, they fell to the ground with a plop. None of them could get up anymore. Yella's face started to turn cold until it was terrifyingly deep. Use the bows and arrows. Don't care so much. Kill, kill. His brothers died, one by one in front of him. Yella's patience and tolerance disappeared at this moment. In exchange, he was filled with endless anger and terrifying murderous intent. Yella was finally serious. He didn't want to capture prisoners of war anymore. He wanted to pay blood with blood. But at this moment, Yella's reaction was still a little slow. Just as he gave the order, the Nuzan cavalry picked up their bows one by one. The number of people who were able to pull the strings of their bows could be counted on 2 hands. In a very short period of time, Yella, who had lost most of his combat power, led less than 10 Nuzan cavalry to start a counterattack. They also displayed their martial arts on horseback to the extreme. Even in the face of continuous fire, these people relied on their nimble bodies to make all kinds of evasive maneuvers, causing the bullets to miss one after another. At the same time, they were also looking for opportunities to release arrows to counterattack. In a short period of time, 7 scouts had been hit by arrows, falling to the ground after being hit by the arrows or being hit by their horses. Yella only brought less than 10 cavalrymen. To be precise, there were only 9 of them. There were only 10 of them, and the first wave of counterattacks hit 7 of the scouts. The hit rate was 70%, which was a rather high standard. Bang bang bang. Using the short period of time when the enemy finished firing the arrows, another 5 Nuzan cavalry were shot and fell from their horses. Yella, who only had 4 cavalrymen by his side, roared and cursed. Then he turned around and left very straightforwardly. After seeing the accurate marksmanship and powerful firearms of the 5-star army, he knew that it was impossible to win with the amount of people he had now. Since that was the case, he left and remembered this hatred in his heart and looked for an opportunity to take revenge. Yila wanted to leave, but how could Su Yunxing allow it? He shouted and gave chase. He himself rode his horse and chased after Yila. Anesthetizing the enemy was only a method. If he really wanted to persuade them to work for him, he knew that all hope fell on the enemy's chiliarch. As long as he captured this person alive, there was a high possibility of subduing the cavalrymen. Otherwise, the problem would be difficult to solve. With a clear goal, Su Yunxing brought a squad of elite scouts and chased after Yella. A squad of scouts just to deal with a single cavalryman. This was extremely rare in the history of Xianxia's scouts. It was also destined that Yella would not be able to escape. Yella's horse skills were indeed very good. His horse was also not an ordinary warhorse. Seemed to be psychic. It seemed to know its master's intentions and rushed out of the encirclement of the scouts several times when it was extremely dangerous. Yella's warhorse was well protected. It was covered with a layer of armor, even the head was covered. Although the weight would reduce the warhorse's running speed, because its entire body was covered in armor, it would give a feeling of being unable to attack. Even if the gun hit the armor, it would not be able to penetrate it. However, the powerful recoil made the warhorse feel pain and neighed. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.